The seeds of the Imperium's near destruction were sown not on some distant battlefield, but in the quiet moments of manipulation and the whispered lies of those who had already fallen. The corruption of Warmaster Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Luna Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus, began on the feral moon of Davin, a seemingly inconsequential world that would become the fulcrum upon which the fate of humanity would balance. Horus had previously brought Davin into compliance during the Great Crusade, installing an imperial commander to oversee the world. When word reached him that this commander had rebelled, the Warmaster returned to Davin to address this betrayal personally. It was here that the first chaplain of the word bearers, Erebus, set his insidious plan in motion. Erebus had long been corrupted by the Ruinous Powers and served as the right hand of Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the word bearers, who had secretly turned to chaos worship after the Emperor's rebuke at Monarchia. During the campaign against the rebel forces on Davin, Horus was grievously wounded by a chaos-tainted blade wielded by Eugen Temba, the former Imperial commander. The wound festered with unnatural corruption that defied treatment by the finest apothecaries of the 16th Legion. As Horus lay dying, Erebus suggested that the natives of Davin, specifically the Lodge of the Serpent, might possess healing techniques unknown to Imperial medicine. Against the protests of his equerry Malaghurst and the Mournival, his inner circle of captains including Ezekiel Abaddon, Horus Aximand, Tarik Torgadin, and Garvil Loken, the Warmaster was transported to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge. There Erebus conducted a ritual that sent Horus's consciousness into the warp, ostensibly to find healing, but in reality to expose him to the corrupting influence of the Chaos Gods. In this warp-induced vision, Horus encountered a twisted version of the future, one where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, where the Primarchs were forgotten, and where the Imperium had become a stagnant, oppressive regime. Erebus, disguised as the Luna Wolf captain Haster Sejanus, guided Horus through this nightmarish future. The word-bearer chaplain showed Horus visions of the Emperor, supposedly abandoning the Primarchs to pursue godhood, claiming that the Emperor had used warp sorcery to create them, and planned to discard them once his ambitions were realized. The vision culminated with Horus meeting a version of himself who had refused the Chaos God's offerings and lay dying, while the Emperor stood uncaring at his side. This deception, masterfully crafted to play on Horus's deepest fears and insecurities, broke the Warmaster's loyalty to his father. When Horus emerged from his trance, he was physically healed but spiritually corrupted. The Ruinous Powers had their champion, and the fate of the galaxy was forever altered. Erebus's manipulations did not end with Horus. The Word-Bearer had been instrumental in spreading the warrior lodges throughout several legions, secretive fraternal organizations that mimicked the traditions of Davin's native culture. These lodges became vectors for dissent and corruption, establishing networks of potential traitors within the Death Guard, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, and Iron Warriors. By the time Horus made his first overt move against the Imperium, significant portions of these legions were already compromised. The first true test of loyalty came at Istvan III, a rebellious imperial world that Horus designated as the target for compliance action. The Warmaster assembled elements from 4 legions, the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters, for this operation. However, his true intention was far more sinister. Horus had identified the battle brothers within these legions who remained steadfastly loyal to the Emperor and could not be swayed to his cause. These warriors were assembled into the first wave to make planetfall on Istvan III, ostensibly to begin compliance operations. Once these loyalist forces were deployed, Horus revealed the depth of his betrayal. The Warmaster ordered virus bombs deployed against the planet's surface. These horrific weapons were designed to eliminate all organic life through airborne pathogens, leaving infrastructure intact for later reoccupation. The Loyalists on the surface, led by figures such as Captain Garvil Loken and Tarik Torgadin of the Sons of Horus, Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, and Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, suddenly found themselves targeted for extermination by their own Legion brothers. The betrayal might have been complete if not for the actions of Battle Captain Saul Tarvitz. Learning of Horus's plans, Tarvitz stole a shuttle and raced to the surface, warning the Loyalists of the impending bombardment. This allowed many to seek shelter in the planet's underground bunkers and sealed buildings. When the virus bombs detonated, they did not achieve the total extermination Horus had planned. The viral massacre was followed by a massive atmospheric firestorm as the released chemicals ignited. The conflagration swept across Istvan III, turning its surface into a charred wasteland and killing millions of civilians. Yet remarkably, thousands of space marines survived in sealed environments, emerging once the firestorm had passed. Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, frustrated by the failure of the virus bombing, led an unauthorized assault to the surface to finish the Loyalists personally. This forced Horus's hand, compelling him to commit ground forces from all 4 legions to complete the purge. What followed was one of the most tragic battles in the history of the Imperium, brother fighting brother across the ruins of Istvan III. The Loyalists, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the determination of men who had nothing to lose. They established defensive positions in the ruins, forcing the traitors to pay in blood for every meter of ground. Captain Garo escaped the slaughter aboard the frigate Eisenstein, determined to bring warning to the Emperor, while Loken, Torgaten Tarvitz, and others prepared for a last stand. For over 2 months, the Loyalists held out against overwhelming odds. The battle became a brutal war of attrition, with the traitors unable to achieve a quick victory despite their superior numbers. Eventually, Horus, growing impatient with the delay to his broader plans, ordered the final bombardment of the planet from orbit, ending the resistance and completing what became known as the Istvan III atrocity. With the Loyalist elements of his core forces eliminated, Horus moved to the next phase of his rebellion. He positioned 7 legions at Istvan V. The Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters would establish defensive positions, while 3 supposedly loyal legions, the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders, were dispatched by the Emperor to crush the rebellion once news of Horus's betrayal reached Terra. The Loyalist forces arrived at Istvan V under the command of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands and once a close friend of Horus. They made planetfall and engaged the entrenched traitor forces in what appeared to be a conventional, if difficult, military operation. Unknown to them, 4 additional legions had also been dispatched to reinforce them: the Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Word Bearers. What followed was perhaps the most devastating betrayal in Imperial history. As the first wave of Loyalists became fully committed against Horus's forces, the 4 reinforcing legions arrived in orbit. Rather than moving to support their embattled brothers, these legions revealed their true allegiance to Horus and attacked the Loyalists from behind. This catastrophic betrayal became known as the Drop Site Massacre. Caught between 2 enemy forces, the Loyalist legions were slaughtered. The Iron Hands suffered the worst casualties, including the death of their Primarch Ferrus Manus, who was beheaded by Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children, in single combat. The once close brotherhood between these 2 Primarchs ended in the most tragic manner imaginable, with Fulgrim, corrupted by a demon-possessed sword, taking his former friend's head as a trophy. The Salamanders and Raven Guard fared little better. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, was captured after being gravely wounded, while Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard barely escaped with a handful of his legion. Of the nearly 80,000 Space Marines who made up the Loyalist forces at the beginning of the battle, barely 3,000 survived to escape the massacre. The 3 Loyalist legions were effectively shattered as fighting forces, removing them from the equation in the early stages of the heresy. With his potential opposition devastated, Horus began his march toward Terra. The traitor forces split to pursue different objectives across the Imperium. Lorgar led a force to attack Calth, drawing the Ultramarines away from the main conflict. Mortarion and the Death Guard moved to secure key supply worlds. Perturabo and his Iron Warriors besieged the Loyalist stronghold of the Imperial Fists at Fall. Meanwhile, Horus consolidated his position and prepared for the final push toward the heart of the Imperium. The conflict escalated into what became known as the Solar War, as Horus's forces finally reached the boundaries of the Sol system. The outer defenses of humanity's birthplace fell one by one as the traitor armada pushed inexorably toward Terra. Perturabo's siege expertise proved invaluable as the Iron Warriors systematically dismantled the Imperial defenses. The Alpha Legion had already infiltrated many key positions, sowing confusion and sabotaging critical systems. By the time Horus's fleet reached Terra itself, the planet had been transformed into a fortress. The Imperial Palace, already a massive complex spanning a significant portion of the Himalayan mountains, had been further reinforced under the direction of Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Every approach was covered by artillery, every wall manned by the finest warriors of the Imperium. The siege of Terra lasted for 55 days of unrelenting combat. The traitors deployed every weapon in their arsenal, from conventional bombardments to demonic summonings. The walls of the palace were breached multiple times, only for the defenders to seal them with their own bodies if necessary. The Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, and White Scars fought with desperate valor to hold back the tide of traitors and their demonic allies. As the siege progressed, Horus faced a strategic dilemma. Intelligence indicated that loyalist reinforcements, including the Ultramarines, Space Wolves, and Dark Angels, were en route to Terra. If they arrived before the palace fell, the traitors would be caught between two forces and likely defeated. This forced Horus to make a fateful decision. He would lower the shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, inviting the Emperor to teleport aboard for a final confrontation. The Emperor accepted this challenge, teleporting onto the traitor flagship accompanied by Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, a cadre of Space Marines, and members of the Legio Custodes and Sisters of Silence. The boarding action immediately went awry, with the boarding party scattered throughout the vessel by warp interference. Sanguinius found Horus first, and despite his prodigious fighting skill, was slain by the War Master at the height of his chaos-enhanced power. When the Emperor finally reached Horus's sanctum, he found the broken body of his angelic son. What followed was a duel of unimaginable proportions, not just a physical battle, but a psychic confrontation between two of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Horus, empowered by all four Chaos gods, initially overwhelmed the Emperor. In a moment that would be recounted in hushed tones for millennia to come, Horus flayed the Emperor's forces apart molecule by molecule with but a gesture. During the battle, a lone custodian named Alanius Pews, or perhaps a terminator of the Imperial Fists, or an ordinary Imperial army soldier, as accounts vary, interposed himself between Horus and the wounded Emperor. Horus obliterated this loyal warrior without hesitation, an act of such callous cruelty that it reportedly convinced the Emperor that his favored son was truly beyond redemption. In that moment of clarity, the Emperor gathered his immense psychic might and struck Horus with the full force of his power. The War Master's soul was annihilated, erased not just from his body but from existence itself, preventing the Chaos gods from claiming it. The Emperor, however, was mortally wounded in the exchange. His broken body was recovered by Rogel Dorn and brought back to Terra, where he would be interred in the Golden Throne, a life support system of incredible complexity that would sustain his ruined form for the next 10 millennia. The embers of the heresy had barely cooled when the Imperium's retribution began. Following the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne and Horus's death aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the Loyalist forces rallied under the leadership of Robute Guilliman. With methodical precision, they began the systematic purge of traitor forces from Imperial space in what became known as the Great Scouring. The traitor legions, now leaderless with Horus dead, and many of their Primarchs scattered, found themselves pushed back from the worlds they had conquered. The sons of Horus, particularly devastated by the loss of their Gene father, retreated under the leadership of First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon. The once proud legion that had nearly brought the Imperium to its knees now fought desperate rearguard actions as they fell back toward the Eye of Terror. This massive warp storm in the Segmentum Obscurus had long been a blight upon the galaxy, a region where reality and the Immaterium bled into one another. Now it would become the reluctant sanctuary for the forces of chaos. The traitor legions did not retreat to the Eye by chance. They were driven there by necessity and the machinations of the dark gods themselves. As loyalist forces reclaimed world after world, the traitors found their options dwindling. The Iron Warriors, under Perturabo's command, fortified several worlds along their retreat path, creating strongholds that would take the loyalists years to reduce. The Death Guard, their bodies now transformed by Nurgles, blessings, into walking plague carriers, spread contagion on every world they touched, leaving a trail of pestilence in their wake. The Emperor's children, having fallen completely into the grip of sensory excess, conducted raids of unimaginable cruelty, taking slaves and trophies before vanishing into the warp. By the early 31st millennium, the majority of traitor forces had been driven into the Eye of Terror. What awaited them there was not respite, but a new kind of war. The Immaterium distorts time and reality. What might be days in real space could be centuries within the Eye. The traitor legions experienced this temporal flux firsthand, with many warriors living through subjective centuries or even millennia, while only years passed in the material universe. This temporal distortion accelerated the changes already wrought by chaos exposure. The World Eaters, their minds already eroded by the Butcher's Nails implants and Khorne's influence, degenerated further into berserker killing machines. Their Primarch Angron completed his transformation into a demon prince of Khorne, his last vestiges of humanity subsumed by rage incarnate. The Death Guard, their bodies bloated with Nurgle's diseases, adapted to their new existence as plague carriers. Mortarion, like Angron, ascended to demonhood, becoming a towering entity of pestilence and decay. The Emperor's children perhaps underwent the most dramatic transformation. Fulgrim, already elevated to demonhood before the Siege of Terra, led his legion into ever more extreme pursuits of sensation. The once disciplined warriors became slaves to their desires, their armor modified to amplify every sensation, their weapons designed to cause the most exquisite pain. Many Emperor's children began to modify their bodies with extra limbs, sensory organs, or other grotesque alterations to enhance their capacity for experience. The Thousand Sons, who had retreated to their refuge on the planet of sorcerers after the burning of Prospero, found the Eye of Terror well suited to their psychic nature. Under Magnus the Red's leadership, they delved deeper into forbidden knowledge, their physical forms continuing to mutate. The flesh change that had once been halted by the Emperor's intervention returned with a vengeance, transforming many into mindless spawn or forcing them to seal their souls in their armor, becoming little more than animated suits of ceramite. The Word-Bearers, perhaps the most organized of the traitor legions, established a new power base on the demon world of Sikaris. Lorgar, who had retreated into seclusion to contemplate the mysteries of chaos, left the Legion under the control of his two most trusted lieutenants, First Chaplain Erebus and First Captain Corferon. They maintained much of their pre-heresy organization, with the Legion divided into hosts led by Dark Apostles who combined the roles of chaplain, commander, and demonic priest. Not all traitor legions found sanctuary in the Eye immediately. The Night Lords, never fully committed to chaos worship, scattered into warbands that continued to raid Imperial worlds from hidden bases. The Alpha Legion, true to their secretive nature, seemed to vanish entirely, though reports of their activities would surface periodically throughout Imperial space for millennia to come. Within the Eye itself, the traitor legions soon found that their common cause had evaporated with Horus's defeat. Ancient rivalries, exacerbated by the corrupting influence of chaos, erupted into open conflict. The Legion Wars began as a struggle for dominance, resources, and the favor of the Dark Gods. Demon worlds, those planets within the Eye completely subsumed by the warp, became battlegrounds as the traitors carved out territories. The Sons of Horus suffered perhaps the most during this period. Demoralized by their defeat and the loss of their Primarch, they became targets for the other legions, particularly the Emperor's children. Fulgrim's Legion, led by various warlords including the infamous Fabius Bile, launched a raid on the Sons of Horus' stronghold and stole Horus's corpse. This final indignity spurred Ezekiel Abaddon to action. Abaddon, who had renounced his father's name and failures, gathered loyal warriors and launched a counter-attack against the Emperor's children. After a brutal campaign, he recovered his Primarch's remains and destroyed them completely to prevent further desecration. In the aftermath, Abaddon declared himself the new master of the 16th Legion, renaming them the Black Legion and swearing an oath to succeed where Horus had failed. The long war against the Imperium would continue under his leadership. The Legion Wars reshaped the hierarchy of the traitor forces. Warbands formed around powerful champions, while others maintained some semblance of their original Legion structure. The World Eaters fractured almost completely after Angron led them on a rampage that culminated in the First Battle of Scalathrax against the Emperor's children. When Karn the Betrayer turned on his own battle brothers in a frenzy, the Legion splintered into countless warbands of berserkers. Throughout this period of infighting, Abaddon was planning. Unlike many Chaos champions who sought demonhood as the ultimate reward, the Despoiler viewed such transformation as another form of enslavement. He would use the powers of Chaos but never be ruled by them. This outlook, combined with his tactical acumen and the growing strength of his Black Legion, positioned him as the natural successor to Horus's mantle as War Master of Chaos. Approximately 2 centuries after the end of the heresy, Abaddon launched what would become known as the First Black Crusade. Leading his Black Legion and allied warbands out of the Eye of Terror, he struck at the Imperium while it was still rebuilding from the devastation of the heresy. His primary target was not Terra or even a strategically vital world, but rather a symbolic one, Cadia, the fortress world guarding the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror. The Cadian Gate, as this navigable corridor through the otherwise treacherous region around the Eye became known, represented both a prison gate for the traitors and the doorway to their vengeance. Abaddon's forces overwhelmed the initial Imperial defenses and established a foothold in the Cadian system. But the First Black Crusade was not merely a military campaign, it was also a quest. Guided by visions and the whispers of the Chaos gods, Abaddon sought out a weapon of immense power. On a world near the Eye of Terror, in a lightless temple built by no human hand, he discovered and claimed the demon sword Drachnian. This ancient entity, bound in the form of a blade, was said to be the end of empires, a manifestation of mankind's first murder. With this terrible weapon in hand, Abaddon's power grew exponentially. The First Black Crusade lasted several years and spread beyond the Cadian Gate to encompass dozens of worlds. While Imperial histories record it as ultimately defeated, with the traitors driven back into the Eye, Abaddon had achieved his primary objectives, testing the Imperium's defenses, claiming Drachnian, and establishing himself as the undisputed War Master of Chaos. He returned to the Eye not in defeat, but to prepare for the next phase of the Long War. During the centuries that followed, the nature of the traitor legions continued to evolve. The rigid hierarchy and organization that had characterized the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade gave way to more fluid structures. Warbands became the predominant unit, ranging in size from a handful of warriors to forces thousands strong. These warbands often formed around powerful champions, sorcerers, or other charismatic leaders. The larger legion structures persisted to varying degrees. The Word-Bearers maintained the most cohesive organization, with their Dark Apostles answering to the Dark Council on Sikaris. The Black Legion, under Abaddon's leadership, grew as warriors from other traitor legions joined its ranks, drawn by the Despoiler's vision and success. The Iron Warriors retained much of their structure under Perdurabo, with grand companies fortifying demon worlds throughout the Eye. Other legions fractured more completely. The Emperor's children devolved into competing warbands of sensation seekers, united only by their devotion to Slaanesh. The World Eaters existed primarily as roving bands of berserkers, occasionally coalescing around powerful champions of Khorne before breaking apart again after battles. The Night Lords, never fully committed to chaos, operated as terror units and raiders, their warbands bound by shared heritage rather than devotion to the dark gods. This fragmentation created new power dynamics within the forces of chaos. Warband leaders who could claim the favor of the dark gods or significant martial prowess attracted followers from multiple legions. Ancient rivalries between legions sometimes gave way to new alliances based on shared devotion to particular chaos gods. A World Eater's berserker might fight alongside Black Legion warriors dedicated to Khorne, while having nothing but contempt for Slaanesh-worshipping Emperor's children. The Eye of Terror itself shaped these new power structures. Demon worlds within the Eye became fiefdoms for powerful champions or staging grounds for raids into real space. The planet of sorcerers, home to the Thousand Suns, became a center of arcane knowledge sought by psychers from all traitor legions. The Plague Planet, where Mortarion established his pestilential kingdom, drew Death Guard and other Nurgle worshippers into its diseased embrace. Resources within the Eye were limited, driving competition and conflict. Slaves captured from real space became precious commodities, used for labor, sacrifice, or raw materials by the Dark Mechanicum, the tech priests who had sided with Horus during the heresy. Ancient technology, weapons, and relics were fought over fiercely, particularly archaeotech dating back to humanity's dark age of technology. Throughout this period of transformation and consolidation, the traitor legions never lost sight of their ultimate goal, the destruction of the Imperium that had cast them out. The long war continued through raids, infiltration, and corruption. While Abaddon's Black Crusades represented the most visible manifestations of this ongoing conflict, countless smaller incursions occurred continuously along the borders of the Eye of Terror and from other warp storms throughout the galaxy. From the ashes of defeat, the traitor legions had forged a new identity. No longer the proud warriors of the Emperor's Great Crusade, they had become something both less and more. Servants of chaos, enemies of the Imperium, and architects of humanity's potential doom. As the 31st millennium progressed into the 32nd and beyond, their long war would shape the fate of the galaxy in ways that even the prescient Emperor could not have fully foreseen. The Chaos Gods are not mere entities, but fundamental forces of the warp, each born from and sustained by the emotions and actions of sentient beings across the galaxy. For the traitor legions, these malevolent powers represent both masters and patrons, offering gifts of power while demanding terrible prices in return. The relationship between the fallen Astartes and their dark gods defines the nature of Chaos Space Marines, transforming once loyal warriors into avatars of cosmic horror. Khorne, the Blood God, embodies rage, violence, and martial pride. His domain in the warp is a brass citadel rising from an ocean of blood, surrounded by mountains of skulls collected from every species across countless millennia. The Blood God cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does so in ever-increasing volumes. His followers live by a simple creed: blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne. No legion exemplifies Khorne's influence more completely than the World Eaters. Once the War Hounds, renamed by their Primarch Angron after he was recovered from the gladiatorial pits of New Syria, the 12th Legion underwent a transformation that predated their fall to chaos. Under Angron's direction, they adopted the Butcher's Nails, neural implants that amplified aggression while suppressing all other emotions. These archaeotech devices, crude copies of those forcibly implanted in Angron during his time as a slave gladiator, irreparably damaged the brain chemistry of the World Eaters. When the Legion finally fell to chaos during the Horus Heresy, they were already primed for Khorne's influence. The Blood God's touch accelerated and enhanced the effects of the Butcher's Nails, pushing the World Eaters beyond mere battle rage into supernatural fury. Their armor, once pristine white and blue, became stained with the permanent patina of dried blood, eventually adopting the red and brass colors associated with their patron. The World Eaters' fall culminated at the Battle of Scalathrax, decades after the heresy. Fighting against the Emperor's children in the freezing night of a death world, the World Eaters were ordered to take shelter as temperatures dropped to lethal levels. Karn, once Angron's equerry and voice of reason within the Legion, refused this command. Declaring that the Legion had grown weak, he took a flamer to his own battle brothers' shelters, forcing them to either fight or freeze. This act of betrayal shattered what remained of Legion cohesion, transforming the World Eaters into scattered warbands of berserkers. In the millennia since, World Eaters' warbands have modified their armor to channel and enhance their rage. Helmets are often reshaped into bestial visages with jaw-like grills that spray blood mist with each exhalation. Their weapons, primarily chain axes, power axes, and other close combat implements, are designed for maximum bloodshed rather than clean kills. Many World Eaters enhance their already formidable physiology with additional implants or demonic gifts that increase strength, reaction time, and pain tolerance. Khorne's influence extends beyond the World Eaters. Within the Black Legion, the Hounds of Abaddon form an elite cadre of Khorne-devoted killers. The Brazen Beast's warband fuses Khornate worship with dark mechanicum augmentation, creating cybernetic berserkers. Even within otherwise undivided warbands, individual champions might bear Khorne's mark, identifiable by their focus on martial prowess and preference for collecting skulls from worthy opponents. Where Khorne represents direct and honest brutality, Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, embodies manipulation, sorcery, and constant evolution. The Lord of Change resides in an impossible crystal labyrinth at the heart of the warp, where reality shifts according to his whims. Tzeentch's followers seek knowledge and power through arcane means, embracing mutation as a sign of their patron's favor rather than fearing it as corruption. The Thousand Suns Legion embodies Tzeentch's principles more completely than any other. Under their Primarch Magnus the Red, himself a being of immense psychic potential, the 15th Legion cultivated their innate psychic abilities despite growing Imperial suspicion of the Psyker. The Legion suffered from a devastating mutation called the Flesh Change that transformed warriors into mindless spawn, a condition temporarily halted by the Emperor's intervention, but never truly cured. Magnus's desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal using forbidden sorcery violated Imperial edicts and provided Leman Russ and his space wolves the pretext to attack the Thousand Suns' homeworld of Prospero. During this assault, Magnus made a fateful pact with Tzeentch to save his remaining warriors, fully embracing the Changer of Ways and transporting his legion to the planet of sorcerers within the Eye of Terror. Under Tzeentch's influence, the Thousand Suns underwent a final, irrevocable transformation. The flesh change returned with greater potency, forcing many warriors to bind their souls to their armor through a ritual called the Rubric, devised by the sorcerer Ahriman. The ritual succeeded beyond expectation yet failed catastrophically. Those with minimal psychic talent were reduced to dust within their sealed armor, becoming animated constructs bound to the will of the Legion's sorcerers. Only those with significant psychic ability retained their consciousness and physical forms, albeit often with extensive mutations. In their current state, the Thousand Suns represent a hierarchy of sorcerous power. At the lowest level are the Rubric Marines, dusty automata that follow orders with mechanical precision. Above them are various grades of sorcerers, from minor adepts to exalted champions capable of reshaping reality. These sorcerers often develop mutations reflecting their patron's favor, additional eyes that perceive beyond normal spectra, limbs that split and recombine, or skin that shifts through impossible colors. The Thousand Suns' armor has evolved to reflect their nature, incorporating avian motifs, Egyptian-inspired decorative elements, and complex geometric patterns that serve as conduits for psychic energy. Many sorcerers adorn their armor with scrolls containing forbidden knowledge or talismans crafted from exotic materials. Their weapons often incorporate warp-infused crystals or are fashioned entirely from psychically responsive materials that change form according to the wielder's will. Beyond the Thousand Suns, Tzeentch's influence appears in warbands like the Brotherhood of Dust, formed from exiled Thousand Suns sorcerers, and the Cult of Mutation, which actively seeks physical transformation as a path to enlightenment. Individual champions of Tzeentch can be found in nearly every trader formation, identifiable by their use of sorcery, tendency toward Byzantine schemes, and frequent mutations. If Tzeentch represents the feverish pursuit of change and knowledge, Nurgle, the Plague Father, embodies stagnation, entropy, and inevitable decay. Yet Nurgle's domain is not solely destructive. It represents the full cycle of decomposition and rebirth, the breaking down of complex forms to nurture new life. The Lord of Decay resides in a rotting garden in the Warp where every disease in existence grows in carefully tended plots, tended by Nurgle himself as a gardener of pestilence. The Death Guard Legion embodies Nurgle's principles with horrific literalness. Once known for their resilience and use of toxic weapons, the 14th Legion under Primarch Mortarion was already associated with death before their fall. Mortarion himself grew up on the toxic world of Barbarous, developing superhuman tolerance for poisons and environmental hazards, traits that were enhanced in his gene sons. The Death Guard's fall came during the Heresy when their fleet became trapped in the Warp during transit to Terra. As a mysterious plague swept through the vessels, even the Death Guard's legendary resilience proved insufficient. Warriors who could endure almost any conventional toxin found themselves succumbing to supernatural diseases that transformed rather than killed. Bloated with infection, their armor fusing with rotting flesh, the Legion suffered agonies beyond comprehension. In desperation, Mortarion called out to any power that would save his sons. Nurgle answered, transforming their suffering into a twisted form of immortality. The plague that had been killing them became a permanent part of their existence, Their bodies became hosts to every disease imaginable yet could not die from them. Their suffering became endless, but with it came new power and purpose as vectors for Nurgle's generosity. In their transformed state, Death Guard Marines exhibit the physical hallmarks of Nurgle's favor. Their armor, once a pristine off-white, has become a sickly green covered in rust, slime, and other signs of decay. The ceramite itself often fuses with the rotting flesh beneath, creating a grotesque symbiosis of man and wargear. Many Death Guard develop grotesquely bloated bodies, their internal organs visible through splits in their skin or armor. Others host swarms of flies, maggots, or more exotic parasites that serve as both weapons and symbols of Nurgle's favor. The Death Guard's weapons reflect their patron's nature: plague knives coated in supernatural diseases, corrupted bolters that fire rounds filled with virulent toxins, and improvised weapons fashioned from their own bodies or the corpses of enemies. They frequently employ chemical weapons, from simple phosphex bombs to complex viral agents engineered by the Legion's biologous putrefiers. Beyond the Death Guard, Nurgle's influence appears in warbands like the Apostles of Contagion, the Tainted Sons, and various Vectoriums that split from the main Legion. Individual champions of Nurgle exist throughout the traitor forces, recognizable by their diseased appearance, supernatural resilience, and the swarms of flies that often accompany them. Where the other Chaos Gods represent aspects of existence that have always been present, Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, is unique in having a definite birth. Created by the excesses of the ancient Eldari civilization, the Dark Prince embodies desire in all its forms, not merely sexual gratification, but every form of sensory experience pushed beyond healthy limits. Slaanesh's realm in the Warp is a place of impossible beauty and horror, where every sensation is amplified to the point where pleasure and pain become indistinguishable. The Emperor's children exemplify Slaanesh's influence with disturbing thoroughness. Once the most perfectionist of legions, obsessed with living up to their Primarch Fulgrim's ideals of flawless execution, the Third Legion's fall began with a single corrupted artifact, a demon-possessed sword that slowly influenced Fulgrim's mind. The Legion's pursuit of perfection gradually twisted into the pursuit of perfect sensation, with battle becoming an art form rather than a military necessity. During the heresy, the Emperor's children's corruption accelerated dramatically. By the Siege of Terra, they had abandoned conventional military objectives to indulge in an orgy of sensation, torturing civilians, and creating elaborate displays of suffering for their own amusement. After Horus's defeat, they conducted a massive raid on Terra before retreating, taking countless slaves to fuel their increasingly extreme needs. In the millennia since, the Emperor's children have modified themselves extensively to enhance sensory experience. Many warriors have their nervous systems rewired to experience pain as pleasure, while others add additional sensory organs to perceive spectra beyond normal human range. Their armor, once the proud purple and gold of imperial nobility, becomes a canvas for disturbing artistry, flayed skin stretched over ceramite, intricate patterns carved into the surface, or psychoreactive coatings that shift color according to the emotions of nearby beings. The Emperor's children's weapons reflect their dedication to exquisite sensation. Sonic weapons that kill through pure sound are particularly favored, from handheld blasters to massive vehicle-mounted doom sirens. Close combat weapons are designed to cause maximum pain rather than quick death, with serrated edges, toxin injectors, or reality warping properties that extend the victim's suffering beyond normal physiological limits. The Legion's organization dissolved after the Battle of Scalathrax, with most Emperor's children forming small warbands dedicated to specific forms of excess. The flawless host seeks physical perfection through continuous modification. The Children of Torment specialize in the artistry of pain. The Phoenix Conclave believes that through sufficient extremes of sensation, they can achieve a form of transcendence beyond even what Slaanesh offers. Beyond the Emperor's children, Slaanesh's influence appears in warbands across the traitor forces. The Sons of Midnight combine Slaaneshi excess with Night Lord's terror tactics. The Violators were once Iron Warriors who fell to the Dark Prince's temptations. Individual champions of Slaanesh can be identified by their focus on sensory experience, often modified bodies, and weapons designed to stimulate as well as kill. While many Chaos Space Marines dedicate themselves to a single patron, others follow Chaos undivided, paying homage to the Ruinous Powers as a pantheon rather than individual entities. The Black Legion, Word-Bearers, and many Iron Warriors warbands take this approach, allowing for greater tactical flexibility at the cost of the specific boons granted to dedicated followers. The relationship between Chaos Space Marines and their patrons is not one of simple worship but a complex exchange. The Dark Gods offer power, purpose, and a form of immortality. In return, they demand service, sacrifice, and the spread of their influence across the material universe. Some Marines view themselves as willing partners in this exchange, while others recognize their status as pawns in a game beyond mortal comprehension. For all Chaos Space Marines, regardless of patron, the gifts of the warp come with costs. Physical mutation, mental degradation, and spiritual corruption are the inevitable consequences of Chaos exposure. Many warriors embrace these changes as signs of favor, while others struggle to maintain some semblance of their former humanity. This tension between power and corruption, between agency and servitude, defines the existence of those who have turned from the Emperor's light to walk the darker paths of the warp. In the aftermath of the Horus heresy, as the Sons of Horus retreated into the Eye of Terror, a pall of shame and defeat hung over the once mighty 16th Legion. Their Primarch was dead, their cause in ruins, and their very name had become synonymous with the greatest betrayal in human history. Among the survivors who had witnessed Horus's failure firsthand was First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, who had served as the War Master's right hand throughout the rebellion. Unlike many who fell into despair or madness, Abaddon's fury only hardened into cold resolve as he watched the Legion Wars tear apart what remained of the traitor forces. Abaddon had been notably absent during the final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Some accounts claim he was fighting elsewhere on the massive flagship, while others suggest he had been wounded in earlier fighting. Whatever the truth, this absence would shape his future. He had not witnessed his Gene Father's moment of weakness firsthand, allowing him to craft his own narrative about Horus's failure. For years after the retreat to the Eye, Abaddon disappeared from sight. Rumors spread through the scattered remnants of the Sons of Horus that their first captain had abandoned them, or perhaps been killed in the brutal fighting that consumed the Eye of Terror. In truth, Abaddon had embarked on a personal pilgrimage through the twisted hellscape of the warp, seeking both answers and power. He walked the surfaces of demon worlds, communed with entities beyond mortal comprehension, and fought duels against champions of rival legions. When Abaddon finally returned, he was changed. His eyes burned with malevolent purpose, and his tactical genius had been honed by exposure to the timeless strategies of the warp. Most significantly, he returned with a new perspective on Horus's failure, one that would reshape the Legion and set the course for 10,000 years of vengeance. Horus was weak. Horus was a fool, Abaddon declared to the gathered captains of the Sons of Horus. He had the Imperium within his grasp, and he threw it away because in the end, he couldn't bear to be what was necessary. This brutal assessment shocked many, but it resonated with warriors who had lost everything following their Primarch. Abaddon continued. The gods offered him unlimited power, and he allowed himself to be dominated by it. I will use their gifts, but I will never be used. This declaration formed the cornerstone of Abaddon's philosophy. He would accept the power of chaos without submitting to it as Horus had done. Where the War Master had ultimately become a puppet of the Ruinous Powers, Abaddon vowed to remain his own master, using chaos as a tool rather than serving as its instrument. The final catalyst for the Legion's transformation came when the Emperor's children, led by the clone master Fabius Bile, attacked the Sons of Horus Fortress on the demon world of Malium. They stole Horus's preserved corpse from its stasis-sealed tomb, intending to use it for their twisted experiments. This desecration galvanized the scattered Sons of Horus behind Abaddon's leadership. Gathering his most loyal followers, Abaddon launched a furious counterattack against the Emperor's children. After a brutal campaign through the nightmare landscapes of the Eye, they recovered Horus's remains. Rather than returning the corpse to its shrine, Abaddon made a decisive statement. He destroyed it utterly, ensuring no trace remained. This act symbolized his rejection of the past and severed the Legion's last tie to their failed Primarch. Standing amid the destruction, Abaddon declared the Sons of Horus dead. In their place would rise the Black Legion, warriors dedicated not to the memory of a fallen demigod, but to the long war against the Imperium. The Legion's colors changed from the sea green of the Sons of Horus to a midnight black trimmed with gold, symbolizing both their dark purpose and the flames of vengeance that would never be extinguished. Under Abaddon's leadership, the newly christened Black Legion began absorbing warriors from other shattered traitor forces. Night Lords without direction after Ker's death, World Eaters seeking purpose beyond mindless slaughter, even former loyalists who had turned to chaos in the millennia since the heresy, all found a place within the Black Legion if they swore loyalty to Abaddon and the Long War. This policy of inclusion proved remarkably effective. While other traitor legions remained bound by their pre-heresy identities and rivalries, the Black Legion became a melting pot of hatred directed outward at the Imperium rather than inward at former brothers. Abaddon did not demand that these newcomers forget their origins. Indeed, many retained elements of their former heraldry or combat doctrines, but their primary allegiance had to be to the Black Legion and its goals. This diversity became one of the Legion's greatest strengths. Former World Eaters brought their expertise in close-quarters slaughter, Night Lords contributed their mastery of terror tactics, and Thousand Sons sorcerers provided arcane knowledge that complemented Abaddon's strategic genius. The Black Legion could adapt to any battlefield situation by drawing on this vast pool of specialized knowledge, making them far more flexible than more doctrinally rigid forces. As his legion consolidated, Abaddon turned his attention to the wider galaxy. Unlike many Chaos warlords who launched raids for slaves or plunder with no greater purpose, the Despoiler began formulating a long-term strategy to bring down the Imperium. This strategy would manifest in the Black Crusades, massive campaigns that would test Imperial defenses, claim powerful artifacts, and advance Abaddon's ultimate objectives step by methodical step. The First Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror in the year 780, one of the 31st millennium, catching the still rebuilding Imperium by surprise. While Imperial histories focus on the battles around the Cadian Gate, Abaddon's true objective lay elsewhere. Following visions granted by the Chaos Gods, he sought out the demon sword Drachnian, the end of empires that had been hidden on a world near the Eye of Terror. After claiming this terrible weapon, which contained an entity born from humanity's first murder, Abaddon's power and prestige grew enormously. This pattern would repeat across the millennia, each Black Crusade appearing to Imperial strategists as a straightforward, if devastating military campaign while actually serving Abaddon's hidden purposes. The Second Black Crusade targeted the Belize Corona sector, where Abaddon destroyed several Loyalist chapters' gene seed repositories. The third focused on the Cadian Gate again, testing its defenses, while Abaddon's agents searched for ancient artifacts beneath battlefields. The Sixth Black Crusade revealed Abaddon's patient nature. He made a pact with the demon Belakar, offering the skulls of the entire Angels of Vigilance chapter in exchange for information about the Blackstone fortresses, ancient weapons of immense power created before the birth of chaos itself. This information would not bear fruit for thousands of years, but Abaddon was willing to wait. During the Gothic War, recorded by the Imperium as the 12th Black Crusade, Abaddon finally put this knowledge to use, seizing control of several Blackstone fortresses and demonstrating their power by destroying the Terrantes star system. Though he ultimately lost control of most of these weapons, the campaign demonstrated his ability to think in strategic terms beyond simple conquest. Throughout these campaigns, the Black Legion evolved both organizationally and physically. Exposure to the warp and the favor of the Chaos Gods transformed many warriors, with veterans of the Long War bearing mutations that reflected their patrons' attention. Yet unlike some traitor legions who surrendered completely to these changes, the Black Legion maintained a core identity independent of the Ruinous Powers. Abaddon himself exemplified this approach. Despite being offered demonhood numerous times, he repeatedly refused, recognizing that such transformation would bind him to the warp and limit his ability to act in real space. Instead, he accepted more subtle gifts, unnatural longevity, enhanced strength, and protection against psychic assault, while maintaining his autonomy. the Black Legion's hierarchy evolved into a meritocracy of cruelty and effectiveness. Beneath Abaddon stood the Ezekarian, his inner circle of advisors and commanders who had proven their worth through millennia of service. Below them were the chosen of Abaddon, warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle and earned the right to bear the despoiler's personal mark. At the lowest level were the newly initiated, often renegade space marines from loyalist chapters who had turned to chaos in recent centuries. This structure allowed for both stability and dynamism. Veterans of the heresy provided institutional memory and experience, while fresh converts brought knowledge of current imperial tactics and technology. The Black Legion thus avoided the stagnation that plagued many chaos warbands, constantly renewing itself with new blood and ideas while maintaining its core purpose. As the 41st millennium drew to a close, Abaddon prepared for his most ambitious campaign yet. The previous 12 Black Crusades had been tests, feints, and resource-gathering operations, all building toward this final push. The 13th Black Crusade would be different. This time, Cadia would not simply be tested but broken, and the Eye of Terror would no longer contain the forces of chaos. The campaign began with simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors, forcing the Imperium to divide its response. Plague fleets struck Agrippina, Slaneshi warbands raided Amistal Majoris, and cultist uprisings erupted on dozens of worlds. These were mere distractions, however, drawing attention from Abaddon's main thrust toward Cadia. The despoiler had spent millennia studying Cadia's defenses, and his assault was precisely calibrated to exploit every weakness. He deployed the Planet Killer, a massive vessel capable of destroying worlds, as a threat that forced the Imperial Navy to commit substantial forces to protect population centers. Meanwhile, his ground forces landed on Cadia itself, targeting the network of pylons that had maintained the stability of the Cadian Gate for 10,000 years. The fighting on Cadia was apocalyptic. Black Legionnaires, many veterans of the Long War who had fought since the heresy, led cultist hordes and demon engines against the Cadian shock troops and space marine defenders. Abaddon himself teleported to the surface at critical junctures, his presence turning the tide of battle wherever he appeared. Drachnian drank deeply of loyalist blood as the despoiler cut through Imperial heroes with contemptuous ease. Despite the ferocity of the Chaos assault, the defenders held their ground with typical Cadian stubbornness. When it became clear that conventional means would not secure victory quickly enough, Abaddon executed the masterstroke he had been planning for millennia. He ordered the remains of a Blackstone fortress, damaged in void combat, to be crashed into Cadia's surface. The impact was catastrophic. Beyond the immediate destruction, the collision destabilized the network of pylons that had kept the warp at bay for 10,000 years. As these ancient devices failed, the boundaries between real space and the Immaterium thinned, then tore completely. Cadia, the linchpin of Imperial defense for millennia, broke apart and was consumed by the expanding Eye of Terror. But even this was not the full extent of Abaddon's victory. As the warp storms triggered by Cadia's fall spread across the galaxy, they coalesced into the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that split the Imperium in two. From the Segmentum Obscurus to the eastern fringe, this immense warp storm separated the Imperium Sanctus from the Imperium Nihilus, cutting off countless worlds from the Astronomican's light and leaving them vulnerable to chaos incursions. For the first time since the heresy, the Imperium faced an existential threat it could not simply contain. The forces of chaos poured through the Great Rift, establishing footholds in real space that would have been impossible before Cadia's fall. The Black Legion led this expansion, with warbands establishing dominion over newly isolated Imperial worlds or launching raids deep into previously secure territories. The Great Rift represented the culmination of Abaddon's patient strategy. Each previous Black Crusade had gathered intelligence, tested defenses, or secured resources necessary for this final push. What appeared to Imperial historians as repeated failures were actually calculated steps in a plan 10,000 years in the making. The despoiler had not simply sought to destroy Cadia, he had aimed to fundamentally change the galaxy's metaphysical landscape, and he had succeeded. In the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, the Black Legion's status among the forces of chaos reached unprecedented heights. Abaddon had achieved what Horus could not. He had split the Imperium and created conditions where victory seemed possible for the first time in 10 millennia. Warbands that had previously maintained their independence now sought alliance with the Despoiler, recognizing that the Long War had entered its final phase. The World Eater's transformation from disciplined legion to blood-crazed berserkers stands as perhaps the most dramatic devolution among the traitor forces. Following the siege of Terra, Angron led his sons deeper into madness as the Butcher's Nail's implants, combined with Khorne's influence, eroded what little remained of their humanity. The Legion retreated to the Eye of Terror not as a cohesive force, but as fractured warbands already turning on each other. Angron's ascension to demonhood accelerated this breakdown. The ritual that transformed the Primarch into a demon prince took place on the world of Genna, where the World Eaters had slaughtered the entire planetary population as a sacrifice to Khorne. As Angron's physical form expanded and mutated, his psychic connection to his gene sons intensified. World Eaters across the Legion experienced debilitating headaches and uncontrollable rage as their Primarch's transformation reached its climax. When the process completed, Angron stood nearly 20 feet tall, his flesh transformed into crimson scales, massive horns crowning his head, and wings of brass and blood sprouting from his back. The newly ascended Demon Primarch led his legion on a rampage through the Eye of Terror, attacking anyone and anything in their path. This bloody migration eventually brought them to Scalathrax, a frozen death world where they encountered a large Emperor's Children warband. What began as a territorial dispute escalated into full-scale war between the two legions. As night fell and temperatures dropped to lethal levels, most combatants sought shelter, planning to resume the slaughter at dawn. Karn, once Angron's equerry and voice of reason within the Legion, saw this pause as weakness. The warrior who had once been known for his calm under pressure had become perhaps the most devoted servant of Khorne in the Legion. Taking up a flamer, Karn burned out the shelters of his own battle brothers, forcing them to either fight or freeze to death in the sub-zero temperatures. This act earned him the title the Betrayer and shattered what remained of Legion cohesion. In the aftermath of Scalathrax, the World Eaters ceased to exist as a unified legion. Instead, they fragmented into hundreds of warbands, ranging from small kill teams to substantial forces thousands strong. These warbands spread throughout the Eye of Terror and beyond, selling their services to any Chaos Lord who could promise them bloodshed or launching their own raids against Imperial worlds. The typical World Eater's warband maintains little formal hierarchy beyond strength and killing prowess. Leadership belongs to whoever can claim and hold it through violence. Many warbands organize around a champion of Khorne, a warrior who has earned the blood god's favor through exceptional slaughter. These champions often bear demonic gifts that enhance their already formidable combat abilities. Brass-like skin that deflects bolter fire, unnatural strength that allows them to tear apart tanks with their bare hands, or blood that burns like acid when spilled. The World Eater's combat doctrine devolved from the disciplined shock assault tactics of the Great Crusade to a straightforward rush toward the enemy. Their signature weapons remain chain axes and power axes, often paired with bolt pistols or plasma pistols for the initial charge. Many World Eaters modify their weapons with teeth harvested from fallen enemies or carve cornate symbols into the blades, believing these rituals please their god and make the weapons more effective. Their armor, once pristine white and blue, has become universally red, sometimes painted but often simply stained with the blood of countless victims. Many warriors add brass trim or spikes, mimicking the aesthetic of Khorne's demons. Helmets are frequently modified to resemble snarling beasts, with grilled vox emitters that distort war cries into inhuman roars. Some veterans of the Long War incorporate actual demon flesh into their armor, creating symbiotic wargear that hungers for blood as much as its wearer. Despite their fractured state, World Eaters warbands occasionally unite for major campaigns, particularly Black Crusades or other large-scale assaults that promise exceptional bloodshed. During the 13th Black Crusade, dozens of warbands joined Abaddon's forces, not out of loyalty to the Despoiler, but for the opportunity to spill blood on Cadia. These temporary alliances dissolve as soon as the immediate battle ends, with World Eaters often turning on their erstwhile allies if no other targets present themselves. While the World Eaters fell through unrestrained fury, the Thousand Sons suffered a more calculated doom. Following the burning of Prospero, Magnus the Red gathered his surviving sons, and through a combination of sorcery and the intervention of Tzeentch, transported them to the planet of the sorcerers within the Eye of Terror. This demon world, later named Sorciarius, became their sanctuary and prison, a place where the laws of physics bent to accommodate psychic phenomena and reality itself responded to the will of powerful psychers. On Sorciarius, the flesh change that had plagued the Legion since its founding returned with devastating effect. Warriors who had been stable for centuries suddenly found their bodies mutating uncontrollably, limbs transforming into tentacles, extra eyes opening across their skin, or their physical forms dissolving into pools of sentient protoplasm. Magnus, himself now a demon Primarch bound to Tzeentch, could no longer protect his sons from this curse, as the Emperor once had. Desperate to save the Legion, Chief Librarian Ozek Ahriman proposed a solution, a ritual called the Rubric that would stabilize the genetic corruption once and for all. Gathering a conclave of the Legion's most powerful sorcerers, Ahriman enacted this spell despite Magnus's misgivings. The results proved catastrophically successful. The Rubric swept through the Legion like wildfire, affecting each battle brother differently based on their psychic potential. Those with significant warp sensitivity found their powers greatly enhanced, often at the cost of further physical mutation. But the majority of the Legion, those with little or no psychic ability, suffered a fate worse than the flesh change. Their physical bodies crumbled to dust inside their sealed armor, their souls bound eternally to their wargear. These Rubric Marines, as they came to be known, retained their combat skills but lost all initiative and personality, becoming little more than automata that followed the commands of the Legion's sorcerers. Magnus, enraged by what he saw as Ahriman's betrayal, banished the Chief Librarian and his closest supporters from Sorciarius. Yet over the millennia, pragmatism overcame anger. The Rubric Marines, while tragic, provided the Legion with tireless, fearless warriors who never needed rest, food, or morale. The sorcerers, their powers enhanced by the Rubric, could direct these dusty soldiers with but a thought, making them ideal guardians and shock troops. The Thousand Sons reorganized around their new reality. The Legion structure shifted to accommodate the divide between the living sorcerers and the animated armor of the Rubrici. Cults formed based on different magical disciplines: the Cult of Time, the Cult of Change, the Cult of Knowledge, and others, each focused on different applications of sorcery. These cults became both political factions and research collectives, with sorcerers competing for resources, Rubrici, and Magnus's favor. On Sorciarius, the Thousand Sons built impossible cities with architecture that defied conventional physics. Towers spiraled in directions that couldn't exist in normal space, libraries contained books that wrote themselves, and observatories looked out not at stars, but at other dimensions. The planet of sorcerers became a center of arcane learning, with expeditions regularly venturing into real space to capture rare tomes, artifacts, and psychers to enhance their understanding of the warp. The Legion's aesthetic evolved to reflect their new nature. Sorcerers adorned their armor with avian motifs honoring Tzeentch's symbol of the raven, added Egyptian, inspired decorative elements recalling their Prosperine heritage, and incorporated complex geometric patterns that served as foci for their spells. Many replaced their standard weapons with force staves, warp-infused blades, or firearms that shot bolts of pure psychic energy rather than physical projectiles. The Rubrici maintained the same armor they wore when the Rubric took effect, though the colors shifted from the original red to predominantly blue and gold. Their eye lenses emitted an eerie glow, and fine dust occasionally seeped from joints in their armor, the only physical reminder of the men who once inhabited the suits. Despite their mindless nature, many sorcerers treated their Rubrici with a strange form of respect, addressing them by their original names and recounting their past deeds, perhaps as a way of maintaining connection to the Legion's lost humanity. While most of the Legion remained on Sorciarius, warbands of Thousand Sons regularly ventured into real space for specific missions. These expeditions typically focused on acquiring knowledge rather than territory, raiding libraries, capturing scholars, or securing artifacts of psychic significance. The Black Crusades provided larger opportunities, with Magnus occasionally leading substantial forces to support Abaddon when the Despoiler's goals aligned with the Crimson King's own inscrutable plans. The Death Guard's transformation occurred neither through rage nor calculation, but through suffering elevated to an art form. During the Heresy, as Mortarion led his legion to join Horus's assault on Terra, their fleet became trapped in the warp by a storm of unprecedented magnitude. The ship's Gellar fields, designed to protect vessels in the Immaterium, began to fail one by one, allowing warp entities to manifest aboard the Death Guard vessels. What followed was a carefully orchestrated torture conceived by Nurgle himself. A mysterious plague spread through the fleet, affecting even the Death Guard's legendary resilience. Warriors who could endure almost any conventional toxin found themselves succumbing to supernatural diseases that transformed rather than killed. Their bodies bloated with infection, flesh sloughing off only to be replaced by fungal growths, internal organs liquefying and reforming in new configurations. For weeks the fleet drifted, filled with the screams of transhuman warriors experiencing pain beyond what even their enhanced physiologies were designed to endure. Mortarion, watching his sons suffer while powerless to help them, finally surrendered to desperation. He called out to any power that would save his legion, and Nurgle answered. The Plague God had engineered this entire situation, creating a perfect trap for a legion whose identity was built around endurance and whose Primarch was known for his hatred of warp sorcery. The price of salvation was complete submission. Nurgle transformed the Death Guard, turning the diseases that had been killing them into a permanent state of unlife. Their suffering didn't end, it became eternal, but with it came new power and purpose as vectors for Nurgle's generosity. Mortarion himself ascended to demonhood, his once gaunt form becoming a bloated parody of life, constantly dripping with toxic fluids and surrounded by clouds of flies. When the Death Guard finally emerged from the warp storm, they were unrecognizable. Their once pristine white armor had turned a sickly green, covered in rust, slime, and other signs of decay. Many warriors had developed grotesque mutations, distended bellies teeming with parasites, extra limbs ending in claws or tentacles, skin that slewed off to reveal writhing maggots beneath. Yet despite their horrific appearance, they moved with deadly purpose, their combat effectiveness undiminished, and in many ways enhanced by their transformation. After the Heresy, the Death Guard retreated to the Eye of Terror, where Mortarion established his domain on a demon world that came to be known simply as the Plague Planet. There, the Legion created a mockery of their homeworld Barbarus, with toxic fogs shrouding fetid valleys and fortresses rising from plains of rotting flesh. The planet itself became a testing ground for new diseases, with captured slaves used to measure the effectiveness of fresh contagions before they were unleashed on the wider galaxy. Unlike many traitor legions, the Death Guard maintained much of their organizational structure. The 7 original companies became the nucleus around which the Legion reorganized, though they expanded and evolved over time. New formations arose based on specialized forms of biological warfare. The Tainted Suns focused on airborne pathogens, the Carrion Tides specialized in vector-borne diseases, and the Drowned developed toxins that attacked through liquid exposure. The Legion's combat doctrine evolved to emphasize their new strengths. Where once they had relied on endurance and firepower, they now added biological warfare to their arsenal. Plague Marines, as the standard Death Guard warriors came to be known, would advance implacably across the battlefield, their bodies serving as incubators for dozens of diseases. Clouds of flies surrounded them, carrying contagions to enemies who thought themselves safely out of reach. Their weapons, corrupted by exposure to their diseased bodies, fired rounds that caused targets to erupt in boils or dissolved armor with corrosive slime. Specialized units developed to exploit particular aspects of Nurgle's blessings. Blightlord Terminators combined the resilience of tactical dreadnought armor with supernatural durability, creating nearly unstoppable shock troops. Biologus Putrefiers experimented with new diseases on the battlefield, using injector pistols to deliver concentrated plagues directly into enemy bodies. Foul Blightspawn carried tanks of noxious chemicals that could reduce even ceramite to bubbling sludge. The Death Guard's fleet, like their bodies, became host to supernatural corruption. Their ships, encrusted with barnacle-like growths and trailing slime through the void, carried planet-killing diseases in their holds. When the Legion besieged a world, they often began by seeding its atmosphere with spores that would weaken the population before a single shot was fired. By the time plague marines made planetfall, defenders might already be struggling with the first stages of infection. Throughout the Long War, the Death Guard have remained one of the most cohesive traitor legions, united under Mortarian's leadership and their shared devotion to Nurgle. While individual warbands operate independently, they maintain communication and occasionally gather for larger campaigns. During the 13th Black Crusade, the Death Guard contributed substantial forces to Abaddon's assault on Cadia, using the planet's fall as an opportunity to spread their contagions to previously untouched Imperial worlds. The Emperor's children pursued a different path of corruption, one focused on sensory perfection rather than physical power. Following Horus's defeat, the Third Legion did not immediately retreat to the Eye of Terror. Instead, they remained in real space long enough to conduct a massive raid on Terra itself, attacking not military targets but civilian populations. This scouring of Terra saw the Emperor's children indulge their darkest impulses, taking thousands of slaves for their pleasure and leaving behind psychic echoes of suffering that would linger for centuries. When Imperial reinforcements finally arrived, the Emperor's children withdrew to the Eye of Terror, where their transformation accelerated. Without Fulgrim's direct leadership, the Demon Primarch had become increasingly detached from his sons as he pursued his own path to sensation. The Legion fractured into warbands based around particular obsessions. Some focused on perfecting the art of pain, others on achieving impossible standards of beauty, while still others sought to compose symphonies of sensation that could drive entire populations mad with a single performance. The Legion's appearance evolved to reflect these diverse pursuits. Their armor, once a regal purple trimmed with gold, became a canvas for disturbing artistry. Some warriors stretched flayed skin over their ceramite plates, creating living armor that twitched and moaned. Others embedded sensory amplifiers directly into their nervous systems, allowing them to experience battle with supernatural intensity. Helmets were modified with extra audio pickups to better appreciate the screams of victims, while weapons were designed to cause maximum pain rather than quick death. The most significant development in the Emperor's children's post-heresy evolution was the creation of the Noise Marines. These specialized warriors embraced Slaanish's appreciation for perfect sound, modifying their armor with sonic amplifiers and wielding weapons that killed through pure sound waves. A Noise Marine's sonic blaster could rupture internal organs without breaking the skin, while the larger Doom Sirens mounted on their backpacks could reduce rockcrete to powder or cause enemy troops to collapse with blood pouring from their ears. Combat for the Emperor's children ceased to be merely tactical and became theatrical. Each battle was an opportunity to create a masterpiece of sensation, with carefully choreographed attacks designed to maximize both effectiveness and aesthetic appeal. Warriors competed to execute the most elaborate kills or inflict the most exquisite suffering, often taking unnecessary risks to achieve particularly dramatic effects. This approach made them unpredictable opponents, a quality that sometimes compensated for their lack of strategic discipline. During the Scouring, the Imperium's campaign to drive traitor forces from loyal space, the Emperor's children proved particularly difficult to eliminate. While other traitor legions fought conventional retreating actions, the Third Legion conducted hit-and-run raids designed to inflict maximum terror rather than achieve military objectives. They would strike isolated worlds, abduct portions of the population for their pleasure, and disappear before substantial Imperial forces could respond. These raids left psychological scars that lingered long after the physical damage was repaired, with some worlds developing entire cultures built around preparing for the Emperor's children's return. The treachery of the Horus Heresy cast a long shadow across Imperial history, but the corruption of the Emperor's finest warriors did not end with the retreat of the 9 traitor legions into the Eye of Terror. Throughout the millennia that followed, numerous Space Marine chapters have fallen from grace, their oaths of loyalty forgotten as they turned against the Imperium they were created to defend. These renegades of later eras represent a different kind of threat, warriors with intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics, often equipped with more modern war gear, and sometimes pursuing agendas that make them unpredictable allies even to established chaos forces. The Badab War provides perhaps the most infamous example of Space Marine rebellion in recent Imperial history. What began as a taxation dispute in the isolated Maelstrom Zone spiraled into a full-scale civil war that would see multiple chapters declare against the Imperium. At the center of this conflict stood Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws and Self, appointed overlord of the Badab sector. The seeds of the Astral Claws' fall were planted in the 901st year of the 41st millennium, when Huron was appointed chapter master after his predecessor's death in battle against Eldar Corsairs. A charismatic leader and brilliant tactician, Huron quickly revitalized the chapter, expanding their operations and influence throughout the Maelstrom Zone. His early successes in stabilizing this notoriously lawless region earned him the title Tyrant of Badab from a grateful populace, a name that would later take on darker connotations. Huron's initial intentions appeared noble. The Maelstrom Zone faced constant threats from pirates, Xenos raiders, and chaos incursions. The overstretched Imperial Navy and Guard could barely maintain control of established worlds, let alone expand the Emperor's domain. Seeing this vacuum of authority, Huron gradually assumed control of not just military matters, but governance as well, appointing loyal officers to oversee planetary administrations and redirecting tithe resources to strengthen his forces. Tensions with the wider Imperium emerged when Huron began withholding gene seed tithes to the Adeptus Mechanicus and refusing to submit to standard administrative oversight. When questioned, he argued that the unique dangers of the Maelstrom Zone required exceptional measures, including expanding his chapter beyond the 1,000 warriors prescribed by the Codex Astartes. By 903, intelligence reports suggested the Astral Claws numbered close to 3,000 battle brothers, a clear violation of regulations established after the Horus Heresy to prevent any single commander from controlling too much transhuman military power. The Administrative Council of the Segmentum Pacificus demanded compliance with imperial tithe requirements, but Huron refused, claiming that all resources were needed for the defense of the Maelstrom Zone. This defiance prompted the Inquisition to dispatch a team to investigate the Astral Claws. When 3 of these Inquisitors disappeared in Badab space, the High Lords of Terra authorized military action. What followed was a brutal campaign that lasted over a decade. Initially, Huron faced only limited forces, primarily inquisitorial agents and naval assets. These early engagements favored the Astral Claws, whose intimate knowledge of local space allowed them to conduct devastating hit and run attacks against Imperial supply lines. Each victory bolstered Huron's confidence and convinced him that his cause was just. The conflict escalated dramatically when several other chapters with ties to the Maelstrom Zone declared support for Huron. The Executioners, Lamenters, and Mantis warriors, all with grievances against imperial bureaucracy or debts of honor to the Astral Claws, joined what was now openly called the Badab Secession. With multiple chapters in rebellion, the High Lords dispatched a substantial force including elements of the Fire Hawks, Marines Errant, Nova Marines, and later the Minotaurs and Star Phantoms. The war reached its climax in 912 with the siege of Badab Primaris, the heavily fortified homeworld of the Astral Claws. For 8 months, Loyalist forces bombarded the planet's defenses while conducting surgical strikes against key installations. The siege broke when the Fire Hawk's battle barge Absolute initiated a suicidal ramming maneuver against the planet's void shields, creating a gap that allowed Loyalist boarding parties to teleport directly into the Astral Claws' Fortress Monastery. During the final assault, Huron was grievously wounded by a Melta blast that destroyed much of his right side. As Loyalist forces breached his inner sanctum, the few remaining Astral Claws fought desperately to evacuate their fallen leader. Approximately 200 battle brothers escaped the Loyalist cordon, fleeing into the Maelstrom aboard the strike cruiser Hiacania. The aftermath transformed both Huron and his chapter. Within the time-warping confines of the Maelstrom, the wounded chapter master was rebuilt through a combination of archaeotech, dark mechanicum innovations, and chaos sorcery. The right side of his body became a mass of cybernetics, while a direct interface with his armor provided life support functions. Most disturbing was the small familiar that took residence in the cavity where his right lung had been, a warp entity called the Hamadria that enhanced his already formidable psychic abilities. Reborn as Huron Blackheart, he renamed his followers the Red Corsairs and established a new realm within the Maelstrom. Unlike many Chaos warbands focused on devotion to specific gods or abstract vengeance, Blackheart built his organization on pragmatic piracy and the accumulation of power. The Red Corsairs raided Imperial shipping, captured Loyalist vessels, and offered sanctuary to other renegade space marines willing to acknowledge Blackheart's leadership. This approach proved remarkably successful. By the time of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, the Red Corsairs had grown from the 200 survivors of Badab to several thousand Astartes, a force rivaling the Black Legion itself. This expansion came primarily through absorbing smaller renegade bands and offering haven to individual space marines who had broken from their chapters for various reasons. The Corsairs became known for their distinctive salvaged armor, often repainted in their red and black colors, but retaining components from dozens of different chapters. Blackheart's domain within the Maelstrom grew to include multiple worlds and void stations, creating a twisted mirror of his former Badab fiefdom. Unlike many Chaos lords who ruled through terror alone, he established a functioning society with clear hierarchies and rewards for service. New recruits surrendered their independence in exchange for protection, resources, and the opportunity for advancement. Those who proved their worth could eventually command their own warbands under Blackheart's overall authority, a system that provided both cohesion and operational flexibility. The Red Corsairs' evolution represents one path to renegade status, a gradual slide from autonomy to secession to outright heresy. Other chapters have fallen more dramatically, often through direct chaos corruption or catastrophic moral failure. The Crimson Slaughter stands as one of the most disturbing examples of this more rapid transformation. Originally known as the Fire Claws, this chapter had served with distinction for millennia, primarily in crusades against Orc expansions in the Segmentum Tempestus. Their fall began in 931 on the hive world of Umidea when they responded to what appeared to be a straightforward rebellion. The Fire Claws deployed their full strength, determined to make an example of the seditious population. What followed was a massacre beyond even the usual brutality of Imperial compliance actions. Over 3 days, the Fire Claws systematically exterminated nearly every living person on Umidea, over 20 billion souls. Planetary defense forces, administrative officials, factory workers, children all were cut down with methodical precision. When Imperial authorities arrived to investigate reports of excessive force, they found a ghostly world of empty hive spires, the only sound the constant wind whistling through abandoned habitation blocks. The chapter's logs indicated that Chapter Master Sevastus Cranon had ordered the extermination after discovering evidence of widespread chaos corruption, but forensic psychers found minimal warp taint in the few corpses preserved well enough for examination. Most victims appeared to have been ordinary Imperial citizens with no connection to heretical activities. The Inquisition launched an investigation, but before any conclusions could be reached, the Fire Claws returned to their fortress monastery and severed all communication with Imperial authorities. Within their isolated fortress, the Fire Claws faced a horror no external enemy could match. Warriors who had participated in the Umidian massacre began hearing voices, whispers at first, barely perceptible even to enhanced Astartes' hearing, but growing steadily louder. These were the voices of those they had slain, tens of billions of murdered souls crying out for justice from beyond the grave. No psychic defense could silence them, no waking hour or sleep cycle brought relief. The chapter's librarians attempted various countermeasures, from psychic shielding to ritual cleansing, but nothing silenced the accusing dead. As months passed, battle brothers began succumbing to madness. Some committed suicide, smashing their helmets against walls until their skulls cracked. Others engaged in self-mutilation, carving symbols into their flesh in desperate attempts to appease the voices. The chapter's chaplains, meant to maintain morale and spiritual purity, were among the first to break, their faith insufficient against the constant psychological torture. Chapter Master Cranon, driven to desperation, sought any solution that might save his brothers. Through forbidden texts in the chapter's librarium, he discovered references to ancient rituals that promised relief from spiritual torment. These ceremonies required massive bloodshed, not the clinical execution of compliance actions, but hot-blooded slaughter dedicated to specific entities. The rituals bore clear hallmarks of chaos worship, but to warriors already on the brink of madness, such distinctions had lost meaning. The first ritual took place in the chapter's reclusium, with 100 battle brothers participating. As they spilled blood in patterns specified by the ancient texts, chanting names that burned the tongue, a momentary silence fell. For the first time since Umidea, the voices quieted. This respite lasted only hours before the whispers returned, but it confirmed Cranon's terrible suspicion. Only through continued killing could they find peace. The chapter, now calling themselves the Crimson Slaughter to reflect their new purpose, launched a campaign of violence across neighboring systems. Each massacre brought temporary relief, but the periods of silence grew shorter, requiring ever more elaborate bloodshed to achieve the same effect. As they descended further into heresy, physical changes manifested, armor fused with flesh, weapons wept blood, and eyes began to glow with unnatural light. By the time the Inquisition mobilized a response force, the Crimson Slaughter had fully embraced chaos. Their armor, once a dignified dark red, became a lurid crimson that appeared wet regardless of lighting conditions. Many warriors developed mutations reflecting their inner corruption, bony crests erupting through scalps, teeth elongating into fangs, or fingers fusing into talon-like appendages. Most disturbing were the ghostly faces that sometimes appeared within their armor, pressing outward as if trying to escape psychic manifestations of their victims temporarily captured during slaughter. Unlike the Red Corsairs, who maintain a semblance of their original organizational structure, the Crimson Slaughter abandoned codex divisions entirely. They reorganized around specialized killing methods, with names that reflected their new identity. The Broken, comprised of those most physically mutated, the Ravagers, who specialized in terror tactics, and the Dragged, former loyalists captured and forcibly corrupted through exposure to the same rituals that transformed the original chapter. The Crimson Slaughter's fall represents corruption through moral failure rather than political rebellion. They did not turn against the Imperium because of ideological disagreement, but because they committed atrocities so severe that only chaos offered escape from the consequences. Their continued existence serves as a reminder that even the Emperor's finest can fall when confronted with the weight of their own actions. Not all renegade chapters embrace chaos willingly. Some find themselves manipulated into rebellion, their noble intentions twisted until they find themselves irrevocably separated from the Imperium they sought to serve. The tragic history of the Soul Drinkers exemplifies this more nuanced path to renegade status. Founded during the 25th founding, the Soul Drinkers believed themselves successors of the Imperial Fists, though later evidence would cast doubt on this lineage. For millennia they served with distinction, particularly in void combat operations where their flagship, the Sanctifier, gained renown for its precision strike capabilities. Their chapter cult centered around the Soul Spear, an ancient artifact supposedly dating back to the Great Crusade, which they believed contained fragments of Rogel Dorn's genetic material. The Soul Drinkers' fall began in the year 945 of the 41st millennium, when the Adeptus Mechanicus vessel Omnisciex intercepted a relic later, identified as the Soul Spear after it had been stolen from the Soul Drinkers by Chaos forces. Rather than returning the chapter's sacred artifact, Archmagos Kabatov claimed it for the Mechanicus, citing technological patterns that predated the Imperium and therefore fell under Mechanicus jurisdiction. Chapter Master Sarpedon, a respected veteran and powerful psyker, attempted to resolve the situation diplomatically. When negotiations failed, he authorized a boarding action to retrieve the relic. The operation succeeded in penetrating the Omnisciex's defenses, but discovered the Soul Spear had already been moved to the Mechanicus fortress on the Forge world Van Arp. Worse, the boarding action resulted in casualties among the Mechanicus crew, transforming a jurisdictional dispute into an armed conflict between imperial organizations. Sarpedon committed his chapter to retrieving their sacred relic, initiating a series of strikes against Mechanicus installations, culminating in an assault on Van Arp itself. During this final operation, the Soul Drinkers fought their way to the central reliquary, where the Soul Spear was supposedly held. What they found instead was an elaborate trap orchestrated by Abraxas, a demon of Tzeentch who had been manipulating events from the beginning. The demon revealed that the conflict had been engineered to isolate the Soul Drinkers from potential allies, while the false Soul Spear contained warp energies that triggered dramatic mutations among the assault force. Sarpedon himself developed 8 arachnid limbs replacing his human legs, while other battle brothers manifested various physical changes. Horrified but unbowed, the chapter master led his forces in banishing Abraxas, believing they had foiled the demon's plan. In reality, the corruption had only begun. Returning to their fleet, the Soul Drinkers found themselves declared excommunicate traitores by the Inquisition for their attacks on Mechanicus assets. Sarpedon, convinced that both his chapter and the Soul Spear had been unjustly treated, refused to accept this judgment. He declared that the Soul Drinkers would continue to serve the Emperor's true intent rather than the corrupt institutions claiming to speak in his name. This declaration placed the chapter in an untenable position, rejected by the Imperium but refusing to embrace chaos. Over the following years, the Soul Drinkers operated as a fleet-based guerrilla force, targeting what they perceived as corrupt Imperial officials and defending vulnerable human populations from various threats. Their mutations continued to develop, though they maintained strict practices to distinguish their gifts from chaos corruption, including regular psychic screening and execution of any battle brother who showed signs of demonic influence. The chapter's isolation led to increasing paranoia and doctrinal drift. Without the stabilizing influence of contact with other imperial organizations, their interpretation of the emperors will become increasingly idiosyncratic. They developed a belief that they represented a third way, neither the blind obedience of loyalist chapters nor the corrupt excess of chaos warbands, but true servants of humanity operating outside a broken system. This philosophical position proved impossible to maintain. Imperial forces hunted them relentlessly, while chaos entities continuously attempted to complete their corruption. The Soul Drinkers found no safe harbor among human worlds, as their mutations inspired terror rather than gratitude even among those they saved. Gradually, the chapter fragmented as individual warriors reached different conclusions about their purpose and nature. The Soul Drinkers saga ended in 980, when Imperial Fist's Captain Lysander led a force to capture Sarpedon after tracking the renegades to a space hulk called the Brokenback. After fierce fighting, the remaining Soul Drinkers were captured and brought to the Imperial Palace on Terra for trial. There, in a final twist, evidence emerged suggesting the chapter had never been Imperial Fist successors at all, but had been created using chimeric gene seed with deliberate impurities, possibly as an experiment by rogue elements within the Adeptus Mechanicus centuries earlier. Faced with this revelation and given the opportunity to die with honor, the surviving Soul Drinkers chose to sacrifice themselves in battle against a demon prince that manifested during the proceedings. Their final act of service to the Emperor they had never stopped revering, despite everything that had happened, earned them a measure of redemption in death that had eluded them in life. The Butcher's Nails implants that define Khorne's followers represent perhaps the most straightforward yet devastating physical alteration embraced by Chaos Space Marines. Originally developed on the gladiatorial world of Nuceria, these archaeotech devices were forcibly implanted in the Primarch Angron during his youth as a slave gladiator. The crude copies later installed in his World Eater's Legion fundamentally rewired their neural pathways, creating an addiction to aggression while systematically destroying centers of the brain responsible for other emotions. The nail's primary mechanism involves the replacement of pleasure responses with pain, except during moments of violence. For a World Eater, the only relief from constant, excruciating agony comes during the act of killing. This neurological rewiring creates a feedback loop. The more a warrior kills, the more his brain associates violence with relief, driving him to seek ever greater bloodshed. Khorne's influence amplifies this effect, transforming what began as a technological modification into something approaching a religious experience. The long-term cognitive effects of the nails progress through predictable stages. In the initial phase, the recipient experiences heightened aggression and diminished impulse control while retaining tactical awareness. As decades pass, higher cognitive functions begin to deteriorate. Strategic thinking gives way to reactive violence, while speech becomes increasingly limited to battle cries and death threats. Veterans of the Long War who have borne the nails for thousands of subjective years often lose the ability to communicate entirely, becoming little more than killing machines responding to the simplest commands. The physical impact of the nails extends beyond the brain. The devices interface with the black carapace and power armor systems, creating a cybernetic network that enhances combat performance during states of extreme aggression. Adrenaline production increases dramatically, muscle fiber density improves, and pain receptors throughout the body temporarily deactivate during combat. These enhancements enable feats of strength and endurance that would be impossible even for standard Astartes, with documented cases of nails implanted berserkers continuing to fight despite injuries that should have been immediately fatal. The most visible external sign of the nails' presence appears during moments of extreme battle rage, when the devices activate fully and protrude through the scalp as glowing metal spikes. This manifestation serves both as a warning to enemies and as a signal to fellow World Eaters that the warrior has entered a state of maximum combat potential. Many veterans enhance this effect by removing portions of their skull plate, allowing the nails greater freedom to expand during activation. For all their combat advantages, the nails represent a technological dead end. The devices cannot be removed without killing the host, and they inevitably cause fatal brain damage over time. Even with Astartes' physiology and Khorne's supernatural preservation, most implanted warriors eventually succumb to neural degradation. Those who survive longest typically ascend to demonhood or receive direct warp sustenance from Khorne, their minds preserved in a permanent state of rage rather than allowed natural deterioration. The most elite Khornate champions often receive additional modifications beyond the standard nails. The Murder Makers, a specialized sect of Dark Mechanicum tech priests dedicated to Khorne, create bespoke augmentations for favored warriors. These include arterial pumps that spray blood in pressurized jets when the warrior is wounded, ocular implants that perceive only in shades of red, and secondary heart replacements that pump superheated blood through the warrior's system, raising body temperature to levels that cause armor to glow dull red during extended combat. Where Khorne's gifts focus on straightforward enhancement of combat capability, the mutations granted by Tzeentch to his followers reflect the changer of Wei's unpredictable nature. The most common physical alterations among Thousand Sons sorcerers include additional eyes, which appear not just on the face but across the body, each providing different forms of perception. These secondary visual organs might perceive the warp directly, see through solid objects, or detect energy patterns invisible to normal sight. Limb transformation represents another frequent mutation, with arms splitting into multiple appendages or reconfiguring entirely into tentacles, wings, or more exotic forms. These altered limbs often demonstrate capabilities impossible through conventional biology, such as the ability to pass through solid matter or manipulate warp energy directly. Many sorcerers can control these transformations to some degree, shifting their physical form according to immediate needs. The skin of Tzeentch's devoted servants rarely remains stable. Colors shift constantly across impossible spectra, sometimes becoming translucent to reveal the warp energies flowing through the sorcerer's body. In extreme cases, the boundary between flesh and armor blurs entirely, with ceramite plates sinking into skin only to emerge elsewhere on the body. This fluidity extends to internal organs, which migrate and transform according to psychic resonances rather than biological necessity. Beyond these physical changes, Tzeentch's most significant gifts operate on a metaphysical level. The most favored sorcerers develop the ability to perceive potential futures, seeing probability threads branching from each moment. This foresight remains maddeningly imperfect. Tzeentch delights in subverting expectations, but provides tactical advantages against less prescient opponents. In combat, this manifests as apparent precognition, with the sorcerer responding to attacks before they occur. The manipulation of time itself falls within the purview of Tzeentch's most accomplished servants. Members of the Cult of Time, one of the specialized sects within the Thousand Suns, can accelerate or decelerate their personal time stream, moving with impossible speed or freezing moments to analyze situations in perfect detail. The most powerful practitioners can create localized time loops, trapping enemies in repeating seconds of existence or revisiting past events to alter their outcomes. Perhaps the most disturbing gift Tzeentch bestows is the ability to manipulate flesh beyond the sorcerer's own body. With a gesture, advanced biomancers can reshape enemy warriors into writhing spawn, transform limbs into useless appendages, or fuse armor directly into flesh. This power extends to the sorcerer's allies as well, allowing for battlefield improvements to cultist troops or even fellow Astartes, though such gifts often prove as dangerous to the recipient as to the enemy. The psychic capabilities of Tzeentch's followers come with substantial risks. Prolonged manipulation of warp energies inevitably leads to mental instability. Many veteran sorcerers develop multiple personalities, each with distinct powers and preferences. Others experience time non-linearly, responding to events that haven't yet occurred or reliving battles from centuries past. Some lose the ability to distinguish between material reality and warp perception entirely, existing in a perpetual hallucinatory state that nonetheless allows them to function as devastating weapons on the battlefield. Unlike the dramatic transformations favored by Tzeentch, Nurgle's blessings operate through subtle corruption that gradually overwhelms the recipient's original form. The process of becoming a plague marine begins with exposure to one of Nurgle's signature diseases, typically the Destroyer Plague or Nurgle's Rot. These supernatural contagions cannot be countered by even Astartes' physiology, instead establishing a symbiotic relationship with the host that transforms rather than kills. The initial stage of transformation involves the breakdown of conventional immune responses. Rather than fighting infection, the warrior's body begins to incorporate pathogens into its own systems. Bacteria colonies establish permanent residence in the bloodstream, viral particles embed themselves in cell nuclei, and fungal networks spread through muscle tissue. This process proves agonizing, with the afflicted experiencing the sensation of being devoured from within while remaining fully conscious. As the transformation progresses, the internal organs undergo significant reorganization. The digestive system expands dramatically, developing multiple secondary stomachs that process toxic materials and generate new diseases. The respiratory system often atrophies, with many veteran plague marines ceasing to breathe entirely, their oxygen needs met through supernatural means. The circulatory system transforms to pump a mixture of blood, pus, and viral agents through the body, often developing additional hearts or pump organs to maintain pressure. The most visible external changes include dramatic bloating as internal gases build up within corrupted tissues. The skin develops a greenish, necrotic appearance while remaining functionally alive, with extraordinary regenerative capabilities. Wounds close not through normal healing, but through accelerated rot processes, with maggots and other organisms consuming damaged tissue and replacing it with new, equally corrupt flesh. Many plague marines develop boils, buboes, and cysts that periodically rupture to release clouds of infectious material. Nurgle's favor manifests not just in physical corruption, but in supernatural resilience. True plague marines can endure injuries that would destroy even normal Astartes. Limbs can be severed only to continue functioning independently or be reattached with minimal effort. Headshots that would be instantly fatal to other warriors merely inconvenience Nurgle's chosen, with critical brain functions redistributed throughout their corrupted bodies. Even total dismemberment may not prove final, as scattered pieces can slowly pull themselves together given sufficient time. This resilience comes with sensory alterations that transform the experience of existence. Pain receptors dull or reconfigure to register agony as pleasurable stimulation. The sense of smell heightens dramatically, allowing plague marines to track prey through the most minute traces of decay. Taste becomes overwhelmingly sensitive, with veterans able to analyze complex biochemical compounds simply by ingesting small samples. These enhanced senses contribute to the Death Guard's expertise in biological warfare, enabling them to formulate new diseases tailored to specific targets. The weapons and armor of plague marines undergo transformation alongside their bodies. Ceramite plates fuse with rotting flesh, creating a grotesque symbiosis that makes it impossible to determine where warrior ends and the warrior begins. Power armor systems, designed to maintain life functions, repurposed to cultivate and distribute diseases. Auto-injectors that originally delivered combat stimulants instead pump virulent toxins that can be weaponized through specially modified delivery systems. The psychological impact of these changes proves as significant as the physical alterations. Plague marines develop a paternal affection for the diseases they carry, viewing them as children to be nurtured and spread rather than weapons to be deployed. This perspective extends to their enemies, whom they see not as opponents to be destroyed, but as unenlightened souls awaiting Nurgle's blessings. The combination of physical corruption and mental reconfiguration creates warriors who fight not from hatred, but from a twisted form of love, the desire to share their grandfather's gifts with an ungrateful universe. Where Nurgle's followers embrace decay, Slaanesh's devotees pursue sensory enhancement to levels that transcend conventional biology. The process typically begins with modifications to the nervous system, increasing sensitivity far beyond normal Astartes parameters. Neural density multiplies exponentially, with new connections forming between previously separate systems. This rewiring creates unprecedented sensory integration, allowing the warrior to taste colors, hear textures, or feel sounds. The standard Astartes augmentations, designed to filter and control sensory input for combat efficiency, undergo systematic reversal. Oolytic kidneys, originally meant to neutralize toxins, reconfigure to synthesize psychoactive compounds that continuously flood the warrior's system. The neuroglottis, intended to detect poisons, expands its capabilities to register thousands of flavor variations simultaneously. The liman's ear, created to filter distracting sounds, instead amplifies every acoustic nuance to create immersive soundscapes. Physical modifications among emperors, children frequently focus on enhancing pleasure reception. Many warriors implant additional sensory organs throughout their bodies, creating new erogenous zones in locations that would be anatomically impossible for normal humans. These additions often incorporate xenotech or warp-influenced materials that respond to stimuli beyond the material spectrum. The most dedicated pleasure seekers replace entire limbs with specialized appendages designed solely for sensory experience rather than combat functionality. The vocal apparatus represents a particular focus for modification among Slaanesh's chosen. Simple vox amplifiers give way to complex sonic weaponry built directly into the warrior's throat. The most advanced of these biological sound systems can produce frequencies capable of liquefying internal organs or shattering ceramite. Noise marines, the elite sonic warriors of Slaanesh, often replace their entire respiratory system with warp-touched sound generators that require no oxygen to function. Visual perception undergoes equally dramatic enhancement. Many Emperor's children modify their eyes to perceive previously invisible wavelengths or install additional visual organs with specialized functions. Some develop kaleidoscopic vision that fragments reality into component patterns, while others gain the ability to see emotional states as colored auras surrounding potential victims. The most extreme modifications allow direct visualization of the warp, though this capability often leads to rapid mental deterioration as the brain struggles to process fundamentally incompatible information. The pursuit of perfect sensation inevitably leads to diminishing returns, as even enhanced nervous systems eventually acclimate to consistent stimuli. This adaptation forces Slaanesh's followers to seek ever more extreme experiences, often through combat. Many Emperor's children develop specialized pain-pleasure circuits that activate during battle, transforming damage received and inflicted into overwhelming sensory events. Veterans describe combat as a transcendent experience, with each wound exchanged representing a conversation of sensation between warrior and victim. For the most dedicated servants of Slaanesh, the boundary between pleasure and pain disappears entirely. Their nervous systems reconfigure to interpret all intense stimuli as valuable experiences, regardless of conventional classification. This perspective transformation makes them nearly impossible to interrogate or torture in traditional senses, as what would be unbearable agony to others registers as fascinating sensory data to be savored and cataloged. The ultimate expression of Slaaneshi modification comes when the warrior transcends conventional physical limitations entirely. The most favored champions develop the ability to experience reality through the senses of others, temporarily hijacking nervous systems to sample unique perspectives. Some can extend their consciousness across multiple bodies simultaneously, creating sensory networks that process input from dozens of sources. At this level of development, the distinction between individual experience and collective sensation blurs, pointing toward the perfect unity of stimulation that represents Slaanesh's ultimate promise to his followers. The armor worn by Chaos Space Marines stands as a testament to both their heritage and their corruption. What began as standard Astartes power armor has, over millennia of exposure to the warp, become something far more sinister. For veterans of the Long War who fought during the Horus Heresy, their wargear represents the last tangible connection to their former lives, now twisted beyond recognition by the mutating energies of chaos. The fusion of armor and flesh represents perhaps the most common transformation. Unlike loyalist Astartes who don and remove their power armor as needed, many Chaos Space Marines find their wargear has become an inseparable part of their physical form. This process typically begins at the black carapace interface points, where the neural connectors that normally allow clean integration between marine and armor begin to grow beyond their designated boundaries. Tendrils of ceramite push inward into muscle tissue, while flesh extrudes outward to envelop armor plates. For Death Guard warriors, this fusion manifests as a necrotic melding, with rotting flesh flowing around armor components and solidifying into a disgusting amalgam that can no longer be disassembled. Nurgle's influence ensures that despite the apparent decay, this fusion creates extraordinary resilience. Armor plates that should be weakened by corrosion instead demonstrate supernatural durability, while exposed flesh that appears vulnerable proves resistant to even anti-tank weaponry. Thousand Sons veterans experience a more metaphysical transformation. Their armor becomes increasingly responsive to psychic manipulation, with ceramite plates shifting position according to the wearer's thought patterns. Decorative elements like scarabs or avian motifs may animate temporarily during periods of psychic activity, moving across the armor's surface to form new patterns or symbols. For rubric Marines, the armor itself becomes the warrior, containing nothing but animated dust, yet moving with lethal purpose when directed by a sorcerer's will. World Eaters undergo a more aggressive melding, with their armor often developing tooth-like serrations along plate edges or bone-like protrusions that extend the warrior's already fearsome appearance. The Butcher's Nails implants interface directly with helmet systems, causing pain engine spikes to burst through both ceramite and skull during moments of combat frenzy. Many World Eaters modify their helmets to accommodate this feature, creating specialized housings that channel the protruding nails into decorative or functional patterns. The Emperor's children pursue a more deliberate integration, modifying their armor with sensory enhancement systems that connect directly to their nervous systems. Specialized receptor panels replace standard ceramite in non-critical areas, allowing the warrior to experience battlefield sensations with supernatural intensity. These modifications often incorporate materials that would be rejected by normal human tissue, such as living metal components harvested from Xenos technology or crystalline structures grown from warp-tainted minerals. Beyond these god-specific transformations, certain changes appear across all Chaos Space Marines as their exposure to the warp increases. Armored joints that once moved through standard mechanical means begin to operate through impossible geometries, bending in directions that conventional articulation would not permit. Power systems that originally ran on promethium or plasma now draw energy directly from the warp, sometimes requiring blood sacrifices or psychic energy to maintain peak performance. The surface decoration of Chaos armor reflects both devotion and achievement. Kill markings, common even among loyalist Astartes, take on ritualistic significance, with specific patterns indicating not just the number of enemies slain, but the manner of their deaths and the spiritual energy harvested from their passing. Devotional scripts in dark languages spiral across pauldrons and greaves, each word containing power that contributes to the armor's supernatural resilience. For the most veteran Chaos Space Marines, those who have fought in the Long War since the heresy itself, their armor contains technologies no longer available to either side of the conflict. Mk2 Crusade armor and Mk3 Iron armor, rarely seen even among loyalist first founding chapters, appear frequently among the original Traitor Legions, maintained through a combination of scavenged parts, dark mechanicum assistance, and warp-influenced regeneration of damaged components. The weapons carried by Chaos Space Marines undergo transformations as profound as their armor. Standard bolters, the iconic weapons of all Astartes, develop disturbing qualities after extended exposure to the warp. Many begin to exhibit signs of awareness, adjusting their aim slightly to target vital organs or developing a taste for particular types of victims. The internal mechanisms, originally precision-engineered by the Adeptus Mechanicus, reconfigure into more organic arrangements that should not function according to normal physical laws, yet perform with deadly efficiency. Chaos bolter ammunition evolves alongside the weapons themselves. Standard mass reactive bolts give way to specialized variants that incorporate warp-touched materials or demonic essences. Nurgle-touched bolters fire rounds containing virulent diseases that continue to spread long after the initial casualty. Cornate weapons load shells designed to cause maximum blood loss rather than clean kills. Tzeentch-influenced bolters might fire projectiles that phase in and out of reality, bypassing armor entirely before rematerializing inside the target. Close combat weapons undergo even more dramatic transformations due to their personal nature and the symbolic importance of direct killing to Chaos entities. Power weapons that once generated stable energy fields begin to manifest the emotional states of their wielders, flaring with crimson energy during moments of rage or emitting soul-chilling cold when guided by calculated malice. The most ancient weapons, those that have tasted blood across thousands of battlefields, develop a measure of sentience, forming primitive bonds with their bearers and expressing displeasure when denied regular combat. Chain weapons, from the humble chainsword to the massive chain fists wielded by Terminator-armored champions, develop particularly disturbing modifications. The teeth, designed to shear through armor and flesh, may transform into actual fangs that gnash and bite independently of the weapon's rotation mechanism. Some chain weapons develop a thirst for particular substances, blood, bone marrow, or even specific gene patterns, causing them to rev eagerly when appropriate targets are nearby. The most prized weapons among Chaos Space Marines are true demon weapons, arms that contain bound warp entities within their physical forms. Unlike merely corrupted weapons, which develop sinister qualities through exposure, demon weapons represent deliberate creations, forged through complex rituals that trap a warp entity within material constraints. The process requires rare materials, significant psychic power, and often substantial sacrifices, making such weapons exceedingly rare even among Chaos forces. The Black Blade of Antwer exemplifies the nature of these cursed artifacts. Originally discovered in the Gothic sector, this ancient sword contains a particularly malevolent entity that actively seeks to corrupt its wielder. Unlike simpler demon weapons that merely hunger for souls or blood, Antwer possesses sophisticated intelligence and long-term ambition. The blade offers tremendous power, enhanced strength, regenerative capabilities, and devastating warp energy discharges, while constantly attempting to subvert its bearer's will. What makes Antwer particularly dangerous is its patience. Rather than demanding immediate corruption, the blade gradually influences its wielder through subtle suggestions and dreams, slowly eroding moral constraints and encouraging increasingly extreme actions. many bearers believe themselves in control, using the blade's power while remaining vigilant against its influence, only to realize too late how far they have fallen. This insidious approach has allowed Antwer to corrupt numerous owners across the millennia, including several inquisitors who acquired the blade intending to study or destroy it. Even more infamous is Drachnian, the End of Empires, currently wielded by Abaddon the Despoiler. This entity, bound in the form of a massive sword, represents humanity's first murder, the moment when human turned against human in the species' distant past. Unlike most demon weapons, which contain lesser entities or fragments of greater powers, Drachnian is a demon of singular significance, powerful enough to challenge even the Emperor himself. The physical form of Drachnian shifts according to its wielder's needs and the demands of battle. Sometimes appearing as a massive two-handed sword, other times as a more manageable one-handed blade, its appearance remains consistently unsettling, a length of darkness that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, with edges that appear impossibly sharp. When Abaddon channels his will through the weapon, it can cleave through any material substance, from ceramite armor to the hulls of tanks, as if they offered no resistance whatsoever. What distinguishes Drachnian from lesser demon weapons is its direct connection to humanity's spiritual nature. As the embodiment of human-on-human violence, each kill it makes strengthens both the blade and its connection to the material realm. During the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon used Drachnian to slaughter Imperial defenders by the thousands, each death reinforcing the demon's power and bringing it closer to full manifestation, a catastrophe that would threaten the Imperium as seriously as any warp rift. Beyond personal weapons and armor, Chaos Space Marines employ larger-scale warp-touch technology in the form of demon engines, massive war machines that combine mechanical components with bound demonic entities. Unlike possessed vehicles, which result from demons infiltrating existing machines, demon engines are purpose-built from inception to house warp entities, with their physical structures designed to channel and direct demonic energy rather than merely contain it. The Defiler represents perhaps the most common demon engine deployed by Chaos forces. Standing taller than a dreadnought, these six-legged combat walkers combine elements of tank, artillery platform, and close combat specialist in a single nightmarish package. The central body typically resembles a Chaos tank chassis, mounted on arachnid legs that allow for surprisingly swift movement across broken terrain. Most Defilers mount a battle cannon or similar heavy weapon on one arm, with the other ending in massive claws or flails designed to tear apart enemy armor. What distinguishes the Defiler from conventional combat walkers is the bound demon that serves as its heart and mind. This entity, typically a lesser demon of Khorne due to the war machine's combat focus, provides both motive power and malevolent intelligence. Unlike servitor-driven Imperial vehicles that follow programmed instructions, a Defiler possesses predatory cunning, actively hunting targets and taking satisfaction in their destruction. The demon's presence manifests visibly in the machine's structure. Components shift without mechanical cause, weapons track targets before targeting systems activate, and damaged sections regenerate through impossible means. The construction of a Defiler requires specialized knowledge possessed primarily by the Dark Mechanicum, tech priests who turned against the Imperium during the Horus Heresy and have spent the subsequent millennia developing warp-influenced technology. The process begins with the creation of a suitable mechanical vessel, incorporating specific materials and geometries that can sustain a demonic presence. Binding rituals then summon and trap an appropriate entity within this shell, creating a permanent fusion of machine and warp creature. Each Chaos god favors specific variants of demon engines that reflect their particular nature. Khorne's forces employ brass scorpions, Lord of Skull's battle tanks, and blood slaughterers, all designed for direct engagement and maximum carnage. Nurgle's workshops produce blight haulers and plague towers that spread disease alongside conventional destruction. Tzeentch favors the Fire Raptor and Helldrake aerial demon engines that combine devastating firepower with impossible maneuverability. Slaanesh's contributions include the Subjugator and Hellstrider, machines that kill with perverse elegance and speed. The Helldrake represents one of the most terrifying aerial demon engines. These draconic machines began their existence as conventional aircraft, typically Chaos Hellblades or captured Imperial Thunderbolts, before undergoing a warp-influenced metamorphosis. Through a process the Dark Mechanicum calls demon grafting, the vehicle's structure gradually transforms from manufactured components to a pseudo-organic form that mimics a draconic creature while retaining its mechanical origins. The transformation process takes decades or even centuries, with the aircraft developing increasingly biological characteristics while maintaining its combat capabilities. Wings that once contained rigid control surfaces develop membrane-like structures capable of impossible aerodynamics. The cockpit reconfigures into a bestial head housing sensory arrays far more sophisticated than the original targeting systems. The engine housing extends into a serpentine tail that serves both as a stabilizer and a weapon, often ending in bladed structures capable of slicing through armor. Throughout this metamorphosis, the aircraft remains functional, often continuing to serve in combat operations even as its form evolves. Pilots who originally operated these craft face a disturbing choice as the transformation progresses. They can either abandon their vehicles as they become increasingly autonomous, or they can submit to a fusion process, their bodies and consciousness gradually merging with the developing Helldrake. Those who choose the latter path eventually lose their separate identity, becoming one with the demon that now animates the war machine. Fully matured Helldrakes demonstrate capabilities impossible for conventional aircraft. They can hover motionless despite their massive weight, change direction instantaneously without regard for momentum, and even phase partially in and out of reality to avoid incoming fire. Their primary weapons, typically flame projectors mounted in the draconic head, draw energy directly from the warp, producing supernatural fire that burns through physical armor and spiritual protection simultaneously. Perhaps the most disturbing fusion of flesh, machine, and warp influence appears in the Obliterators, Chaos Space Marines who have undergone a transformation that blurs the distinction between warrior, weapon, and demon. These monstrous figures, standing significantly taller and broader than even Terminator armored Astartes, represent the endpoint of the techno-viral infection known as the Obliterator virus, a warp-influenced contagion that transforms its victims into living weapon platforms. The virus typically infects Marines with close ties to technology, tech Marines, warpsmiths, or those with extensive bionic enhancements. The initial symptoms appear beneficial, with the infected warrior developing the ability to interface directly with weapons and machinery without standard connecting devices. This capability rapidly progresses beyond normal technological interaction as the Marine gains the ability to absorb weapons into his own flesh, storing them within a pocket dimension partially connected to the warp. As the infection advances, the distinction between the Marine's body and his equipment disappears entirely. Armor fuses permanently with flesh, creating a grotesque amalgam that can no longer be separated into component parts. Internal organs reconfigure to produce ammunition, power cells, and other consumable components that would normally require external supply. The warrior's limbs develop the ability to transform into various weapons, flesh and bone flowing like liquid metal to form barrels, blades, or crushing implements according to tactical requirements. The final stage of transformation sees the Obliterator transcend normal physical constraints entirely. Their bodies become conduits between real space and the warp, allowing them to manifest increasingly improbable weapons directly from their flesh. A hand might transform into a multi-melta in one moment, then reconfigure into a power fist the next, with no apparent limit to the variety of armaments available. This capability makes Obliterators extraordinarily versatile combatants, able to adapt their loadout instantly to counter any enemy they face. The psychological impact of this transformation proves as significant as the physical changes. Most Obliterators develop an obsessive fixation on weapons technology, constantly seeking new designs to incorporate into their ever-expanding internal arsenal. This compulsion drives them to attack weapons facilities, museum worlds, or even loyalist forge worlds in search of new patterns to absorb. Many develop a form of technological synesthesia, experiencing weapons as flavors or sensations rather than merely functional tools. Despite their obvious value to Chaos forces, obliterators often operate as independent mercenaries rather than integrated Legion components. Their condition creates a form of detachment from normal military structures, with many viewing themselves as living arsenals rather than soldiers. Warband leaders typically employ obliterators for specific high-value operations, offering rare weapons or technological artifacts as payment rather than the territory or slaves that might motivate other Chaos forces. Chaos Space Marine warfare bears little resemblance to the disciplined, coordinated campaigns of their loyalist counterparts. Where Imperial forces typically engage in carefully planned operations with clear strategic objectives, Chaos warbands favor lightning raids, terror tactics, and psychological warfare designed to maximize both material gain and spiritual corruption. This fundamental difference stems not merely from ideology but practical necessity. Lacking the vast logistical infrastructure of the Imperium, traitor forces must operate as predators rather than conquerors. The raid-based strategy employed by most Chaos warbands represents a tactical evolution born of circumstance. Unable to maintain extended supply lines or hold territory against concentrated Imperial counterattacks, Chaos commanders typically target isolated worlds or installations, striking with overwhelming force before withdrawing with prisoners, resources, and technology. These operations follow a distinctive pattern that has proven remarkably effective across 10,000 years of the Long War. Target selection for Chaos raids involves considerations beyond simple military vulnerability. Warbands seeking slaves might prioritize agri-worlds with large, physically robust populations accustomed to hardship. Those requiring technological components typically target isolated Mechanicum outposts or supply convoys rather than heavily defended Forge worlds. Warband leaders dedicated to specific Chaos gods often choose targets with symbolic significance. Cornate warbands might attack shrine worlds to desecrate holy sites, while Tzeentch-aligned forces prefer targets rich in forbidden knowledge or psychic potential. The Black Legion's raid on the shrine world of Dianaxis exemplifies this approach to target selection. Rather than attacking the heavily defended central cathedral cities, Abaddon's forces struck at isolated monastery complexes housing ancient relics. Each complex contained fragments of a psychic map, leading to a powerful artifact hidden during the Horus Heresy. By the time Imperial defenders realized the pattern of attacks, the Black Legion had already assembled the complete map and departed the system with minimal casualties. Intelligence gathering precedes effective raids, with Chaos forces employing methods ranging from conventional infiltration to supernatural scrying. Many warbands maintain networks of cultists on Imperial worlds who provide information about defenses, valuable targets, and potential weaknesses. These cultist cells often operate for decades or even centuries before their Chaos masters call upon them, gradually gaining positions of influence within planetary governance or defense forces. The Alpha Legion perfected this approach during the Kryptos campaign, where operatives infiltrated the planetary defense force 20 years before the actual invasion. By the time the Legion's warships appeared in system, cultists had disabled orbital defense platforms, corrupted targeting cogitators, and assassinated key command personnel. What Imperial strategists had classified as a fortress world fell within hours, with most defenders unaware they were fighting alongside traitors until Alpha Legion drop pods were already on the surface. More supernaturally inclined warbands employ sorcerous methods to gather intelligence. Thousand Suns scryers can project their consciousness across vast distances, observing target locations without physical presence. Death Guard forces often release plague spores containing minor nurgling entities that infiltrate target worlds months or years in advance, gathering information while spreading low-level disease to weaken resistance. Wordbearer's Dark Apostles commune with warp entities to receive visions of weakly defended but valuable targets, interpreting symbolic dreams to identify optimal raid locations. The approach phase of Chaos raids demonstrates a sophistication that belies their apparently barbaric nature. Rather than relying solely on brute force, Chaos fleets employ specialized vessels and techniques to bypass Imperial defenses. demon ships can temporarily phase into the warp during real space transit, becoming invisible to conventional auger arrays. Specialized dark mechanicum jamming vessels broadcast warp-tainted signals that not only disrupt communications, but can drive listening post operators insane, creating confusion within defense networks. The Night Lord's attack on the Avarax system demonstrated their mastery of approach tactics. 3 strike cruisers entered the system with drives and power systems running minimal emissions, appearing to augur arrays as space debris or small asteroids. By the time defense forces recognized the threat, Night Lord's boarding parties had already disabled 2 orbital platforms and seized control of the system's defense coordination station. With the defensive network compromised, the main Night Lord's fleet translated from the warp directly into optimal attack position, bypassing the carefully constructed outer defense perimeter entirely. For worlds with substantial ground-based defenses, Chaos forces often employ cultist uprisings to create diversions or disable key installations from within. These cultist networks operate differently from conventional infiltration agents, focusing on quantity rather than quality. Where Alpha Legion sleeper agents might hold command positions, cults dedicated to Nurgle or Slaanesh spread among the general population, particularly in underhive environments or industrial zones, where Imperial authority maintains minimal presence. The Vraxian War provides the definitive example of cultist effectiveness in preparing a world for chaos assault. Cardinal Zaffin, corrupted by Alpha Legion operatives, gradually replaced loyal defense personnel with his own followers over several decades. When he finally declared his rebellion, over half the planetary defense force immediately sided with him, while cultist cells activated across the planet's industrial zones. By the time Imperial authorities responded, the rebels had seized the substantial munitions stockpiles that made Vrax a target in the first place, turning the world into a fortress that would require nearly 2 decades of siege to reclaim. Cultist uprisings serve multiple tactical purposes beyond simple sabotage. Mass civil unrest forces planetary defenders to divide their attention between external and internal threats, often committing substantial forces to urban pacification rather than perimeter defense. Civilian casualties from suppression actions create resentment that cultist agitators can exploit, potentially turning initially loyal citizens against Imperial authorities. Perhaps most valuably, uprisings generate fear and confusion that resonates in the warp, potentially weakening the barrier between real space and the Immaterium enough to allow for sorcerous exploitation. The World Eater's assault on Megalax's hive demonstrates the tactical integration of cultist uprisings with external attack. Cornate cultists seized the hive's water purification system, adding psychoactive compounds that increased aggression while decreasing impulse control among the general population. As riots erupted across lower hive levels, planetary defense forces deployed to contain the violence. With security forces concentrated in the hive, World Eaters drop pods landed near the relatively undefended planetary defense batteries. By the time Imperial commanders realized the riots were a diversion, Cornate Berserkers had already disabled the anti-orbital defenses and cleared landing zones for the main assault force. Sorcery represents perhaps the most distinctive element of Chaos Space Marine warfare, providing capabilities that have no equivalent in Loyalist arsenals. Beyond simple psychic attacks, true sorcery involves complex rituals that manipulate the fundamental nature of reality, creating effects that appear miraculous or impossible to those without warp knowledge. These techniques require substantial preparation and often significant sacrifices, but their battlefield impact can prove decisive against unprepared opponents. Weather manipulation represents one of the most common sorcerous techniques employed during chaos raids. Storms conjured through warp rituals provide cover for approaching forces, interfere with targeting systems, and disrupt communication networks. More advanced practitioners can create specific atmospheric conditions optimized for their forces. Nurgle sorcerers might generate warm, humid conditions ideal for plague spread, while Night Lord's ritualists specialize in creating impenetrable darkness that enhances their terror tactics. The Iron Warrior's Siege of Hydra Cordatus incorporated weather manipulation as a core strategic element. Warpsmiths conducted rituals that generated continent-spanning dust storms, reducing visibility and clogging the mechanisms of Imperial defensive emplacements. These unnatural storms contained warp energy that interfered with targeting cogitators and communication systems, effectively isolating defensive positions from central command. By the time the storms abated, Iron Warrior's siege units had established fortified positions within optimal range of the Imperial defenses, completely bypassing the anticipated killing grounds. Teleportation rituals provide chaos forces with infiltration capabilities that can bypass even the most sophisticated defenses. Unlike the relatively short-range teleporters employed by Loyalist forces, which require precise coordinates and substantial power sources, Chaos sorcerers can open temporary warp portals, allowing troops to traverse vast distances. These portals typically require ritual preparation on at least one end of the transit, with sorcerers using symbolic connections like blood from target world inhabitants or physical objects from the destination to establish the necessary warp resonance. The Word-Bearer's attack on the Fortress Monastery of the Angels Vigilant demonstrates the strategic advantage of sorceress teleportation. Dark Apostle Corps Megron conducted a ritual using blood from captured chapter serfs, creating a sympathetic connection to the monastery's reliquary. The ritual opened a warp portal directly within the chapter's most sacred chamber, bypassing void shields, physical walls, and automated defenses. A Word-Bearer's Terminator squad emerged from the portal and secured the chamber before defenders could respond, using the reliquary's holy objects as focus points for additional portals that allowed hundreds of Word-Bearers to teleport directly into the heart of the fortress. Time manipulation, while rarer and more dangerous than other sorceress techniques, provides perhaps the most significant tactical advantage when successfully employed. Thousand Sons sorcerers specializing in the Pavoni discipline can create localized temporal distortions, causing enemy forces to experience time at different rates than the surrounding environment. Warriors caught in these distortions move with glacial slowness while perceiving the world around them at normal speed, a psychologically devastating experience as they watch themselves being outmaneuvered and killed while unable to respond. The differences between Legion-based warfare and Warband approaches become most apparent in larger campaigns where multiple chaos forces operate simultaneously. During the Heresy, traitor legions functioned as coherent military organizations with clear chains of command, standardized tactics, and coordinated strategic objectives. 10,000 years of exposure to the warp has eroded this organizational coherence, with most legions fragmenting into warbands that operate independently even when nominally pursuing common goals. The Word-Bearers maintain perhaps the closest approximation to their Heresy-era structure. Dark Apostles leading hosts of approximately 1,000 warriors still answer to the Dark Council on Sikaris, with Corferon and Erebus establishing strategic objectives that align with their interpretations of Lorgar's will. This command structure allows for coordinated campaigns across multiple systems, with different hosts assigned complementary objectives that support an overarching strategic goal. The Crimson Path campaign exemplifies this approach, with 7 Word-Bearers hosts simultaneously attacking systems along a carefully plotted trajectory, creating a path of warp-resonant destruction that temporarily weakened the barrier between real space and the Immaterium along a specific route. The Black Legion operates through a more feudal structure, with semi-independent warlords swearing personal allegiance to Abaddon rather than maintaining a standardized military hierarchy. Each warlord commands their own warband, ranging from small strike forces of dozens to substantial armies thousands strong. Abaddon coordinates these forces through direct command of his most trusted lieutenants, who in turn direct lesser warlords according to the Despoiler's strategic vision. This arrangement sacrifices some tactical coordination in exchange for flexibility, allowing the Black Legion to simultaneously pursue multiple objectives across vast distances. The 13th Black Crusade demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach, with Black Legion forces striking dozens of systems simultaneously. Some attacks served as genuine strategic objectives, while others functioned as diversions to draw Imperial forces away from Abaddon's true targets. The feudal command structure allowed warband leaders to adapt to local conditions without requiring constant communication with central authority, creating an offensive too distributed for Imperial forces to counter effectively. At the opposite extreme, World Eaters warbands demonstrate the complete collapse of Legion-based structure. With no central authority since Angron's disappearance into the warp, each warband operates entirely independently, following the whims of its current leader without coordination even with other World Eaters groups. When multiple warbands converge on a single target, they typically compete as much as cooperate, racing to claim the most impressive kills or secure the choicest territory. This approach sacrifices strategic coherence, but creates an unpredictable assault pattern that can overwhelm organized defenses through sheer ferocity and unexpected attack vectors. Karn the Betrayer's descent into madness began long before the infamous massacre at Scalathrax. As Angron's equerry during the Great Crusade, Karn served as the voice of reason within the World Eaters, often mediating between his increasingly unstable Primarch and the Legion's officer corps. When Angron ordered the implantation of the Butcher's Nails in his warriors, Karn was among the first to undergo the procedure, believing that sharing his Primarch's pain would bring the Legion closer together. This fateful decision would set him on the path to becoming Khorne's most infamous champion. During the heresy, Karn's reputation as a skilled warrior grew with each compliance action turned massacre. At Istvan III, he slaughtered loyalist World Eaters with methodical precision, his fighting style still disciplined despite the Nail's influence. By the Siege of Terra, however, the balance had shifted. The constant pain inflicted by the neural implants, combined with years of combat stress and exposure to the warp, had eroded much of Karn's self-control. On the walls of the Imperial Palace, he achieved a kill count that impressed even his bloodthirsty battle brothers, personally slaying over 70 loyalist Astartes in a single day of fighting. The aftermath of Horus's defeat saw the World Eaters retreat to the Eye of Terror in disarray. Without the unifying presence of their Primarch, who had ascended to demonhood and grown increasingly detached from his sons, the Legion began to fragment. This disintegration culminated at Scalathrax, where the World Eaters found themselves in territorial conflict with the Emperor's children. As night fell on the Death World, temperatures dropped to levels lethal even for Astartes' physiology, forcing both sides to seek shelter. Karn, viewing this pause in the slaughter as weakness, took up a flamer and began burning out the shelters of his own battle brothers, forcing them to either fight or freeze. "Blood for the Blood God," he reportedly shouted as he moved through the World Eaters' positions. What does it matter whose blood is spilled, so long as it flows? This act of betrayal against his own legion earned him his infamous title and cemented his status as Khorne's foremost mortal champion. In the millennia since, Karn has become a force of nature on the battlefield. His armor, once the white and blue of the World Eaters, is now a deep crimson permanently stained with the blood of countless victims. He wields Gorechild, one of the twin chain axes once carried by Angron himself, its adamantium teeth harvested from the maw of a mica dragon and capable of cutting through virtually any material. His helm, modified to accommodate the constantly protruding Butcher's Nails, features a targeting reticule over one eye, a reminder of his once tactical approach to warfare, now serving primarily to identify the next source of blood. What makes Karn truly terrifying is not merely his martial prowess, but his complete unpredictability. Unlike many Chaos champions who can be baited or manipulated through their ambitions, Karn exists solely to spill blood in Khorne's name. He has been known to turn on allies mid-battle if enemy forces prove insufficient for his bloodlust. This unpredictability extends to his combat style, capable of both berserk fury and surprising tactical insight, often within moments of each other, as if two different warriors inhabit the same armor. Despite his apparent madness, Karn retains a terrible clarity of purpose. He understands his role as Khorne's executioner and embraces it without reservation. Unlike champions who serve chaos seeking personal power or ascension to demonhood, Karn appears content with his eternal hunt. This single-minded dedication has made him virtually unkillable. Reports of his death have surfaced numerous times throughout Imperial history, only for the betrayer to reappear in subsequent conflicts, his armor bearing new battle damage but his lethal purpose unchanged. Where Karn's corruption manifests as straightforward bloodlust, Ozek Ahriman's fall represents a more intellectual tragedy. As chief librarian of the Thousand Sons during the Great Crusade, Ahriman was renowned for his scholarly approach to psychic phenomena. His extensive research into warp energies made him one of the most accomplished psychers in the Legion's Astartes, second only to Magnus the Red himself. This academic pursuit of knowledge would eventually lead him to commit one of the most devastating acts of sorcery in Imperial history. The seeds of Ahriman's fall were planted during the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor banned the use of psychic powers within the legions. For the Thousand Sons, whose combat doctrine centered around psychic abilities, this edict represented an existential threat. Though Magnus initially ordered compliance, he secretly continued his own sorcerous explorations, eventually attempting to psychically warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal. This desperate act breached the wards protecting the Imperial Palace and provided justification for the Space Wolves' attack on Prospero. In the aftermath of Prospero's destruction, Magnus led his surviving sons to the planet of sorcerers within the Eye of Terror. There, the flesh change that had plagued the Legion since its founding returned with devastating effect. Warriors who had been stable for centuries suddenly found their bodies mutating uncontrollably, transforming into mindless spawn as their physical forms rebelled against reality itself. Watching his battle brothers suffer this fate, Ahriman conceived of a desperate solution. The ritual that would become known as the Rubric of Ahriman represented years of research compressed into a desperate gamble. Gathering a conclave of the Legion's remaining senior sorcerers, Ahriman proposed a spell that would halt the flesh change permanently. Despite Magnus's misgivings, the ritual proceeded, partly because many sorcerers supported Ahriman's plan, and partly because the demon Primarch himself was curious about what his chief librarian might accomplish. The results proved catastrophically successful. The rubric swept through the Legion like wildfire, affecting each battle brother differently based on their psychic potential. The strongest psychers found their powers greatly enhanced, often at the cost of further physical mutation. But the majority of the Legion, those with minimal psychic ability, suffered a fate worse than the flesh change. Their physical bodies crumbled to dust inside their sealed armor, their souls bound eternally to their wargear. These rubric Marines, as they came to be known, retained their combat skills but lost all initiative and personality, becoming little more than automata that followed the commands of the Legion's sorcerers. Magnus, enraged by what he saw as Ahriman's betrayal, banished the chief librarian and his closest supporters from the planet of sorcerers. "You have achieved nothing," Magnus reportedly told Ahriman as he cast him out. "Dust you have made, and dust you shall remain." This exile marked the beginning of Ahriman's solo journey through the Eye of Terror and beyond, searching for knowledge that might undo the damage his rubric had caused. Over the following millennia, Ahriman's quest evolved from a simple desire to restore his brothers into a broader pursuit of perfect understanding. He began collecting ancient texts, artifacts, and lore from across the galaxy, building a library of forbidden knowledge unmatched outside the Black Library of the Eldar. His warband, comprised of exiled Thousand Sons sorcerers and bound rubric Marines, conducted raids targeting primarily information rather than territory or resources. The most ambitious of Ahriman's operations targeted the Webway, the labyrinthine dimension used by the Eldar to travel between worlds. By breaching this network, Ahriman sought access to the Black Library itself, believing it contained knowledge sufficient to undo the rubric, and perhaps even challenge the Chaos Gods themselves. These incursions brought him into repeated conflict with the Eldar, who recognized in the exiled sorcerer a threat potentially greater than any demon. What makes Ahriman particularly dangerous is his methodical approach to corruption. Unlike berserkers who embrace chaos through bloodshed or hedonists who seek sensation, Ahriman pursues knowledge with scientific precision. Each forbidden text he acquires, each ritual he masters, represents another step toward his ultimate goal. This intellectual framework allows him to maintain the illusion of control, even as he delves deeper into powers that inevitably corrupt. He does not see himself as serving Tzeentch, but rather using the Changer of Ways gifts to pursue his own agenda. This self-deception represents Tzeentch's greatest victory over his most accomplished mortal servant. Every action Ahriman takes to undo the rubric actually serves to bind him more tightly to his patron's schemes. The webway breaches he engineers create new paths for demons to enter real space. The knowledge he accumulates spreads change and instability wherever he applies it. Even his limited successes in temporarily restoring certain rubric marines feed into Tzeentch's love of false hope and doomed aspirations. Typhus the Traveler, born Kala's Typhon on the death world of Barbarus, represents corruption through deliberate choice rather than tragic misjudgment. As first captain of the Death Guard during the Great Crusade, Typhon served as one of Mortarian's most trusted lieutenants despite fundamental differences in their outlook. Where Mortarian despised psychers and warpcraft due to his experiences with the Witch Lords of Barbarus, Typhon secretly harbored considerable psychic talent and an interest in forbidden knowledge. This contradiction within the Death Guard's command structure created the perfect opportunity for chaos corruption. While Mortarian maintained his hatred of the Warp even as he joined Horus's rebellion, Typhon had already established contact with Nurgle's servants. As the heresy progressed, the first captain gathered around him a cadre of like-minded officers who shared his occult interests, forming a hidden lodge within the Death Guard that practiced ritual sorcery away from their Primarch's disapproving gaze. Typhon's betrayal of Mortarian came to fruition during the Death Guard's transit to Terra. As fleet navigator, he used his position to guide the Legion's ships into a massive warp storm, then eliminated the navigators and Gellar field technicians, claiming they had been exposed as loyalist agents. With the fleet stranded in the warp and their protective fields failing, the Death Guard found themselves exposed to the full corrupting influence of the Immaterium. What followed was a carefully orchestrated torture conceived by Nurgle himself. A mysterious plague spread through the fleet, affecting even the Death Guard's legendary resilience. Warriors who could endure almost any conventional toxin found themselves succumbing to supernatural diseases that transformed rather than killed. Their bodies bloated with infection, flesh sloughing off only to be replaced by fungal growths, internal organs liquefying and reforming in new configurations. For weeks the fleet drifted, filled with the screams of transhuman warriors experiencing pain beyond what even their enhanced physiologies were designed to endure. Mortarian, watching his sons suffer while powerless to help them, finally surrendered to desperation. He called out to any power that would save his legion, and Nurgle answered, a moment of weakness that Typhon had engineered from the beginning. The price of salvation was complete submission. Nurgle transformed the Death Guard, turning the diseases that had been killing them into a permanent state of unlife. Their suffering didn't end, it became eternal, but with it came new power and purpose as vectors for Nurgle's generosity. Mortarian himself ascended to demonhood, his once gaunt form becoming a bloated parody of life, constantly dripping with toxic fluids and surrounded by clouds of flies. Typhon, now calling himself Typhus the Traveler, host of the Destroyer Hive, emerged from this transformation as Nurgle's foremost champion within the Death Guard. His armor became host to a particular strain of warp entity called the Destroyer Hive, a swarm of supernatural insects that devour him from within while using his body as an incubator for new plagues. This symbiotic relationship grants Typhus immunity to all disease while allowing him to serve as a vector for constantly evolving contagions. In the millennia since the heresy, Typhus has operated with surprising independence from Mortarian. While nominally still part of the Death Guard Legion, he commands his own massive plague fleet called the Plague Fleet, which roams the galaxy spreading Nurgle's gifts to unsuspecting worlds. This partial autonomy stems from Nurgle's direct patronage. Having engineered the Death Guard's fall, Typhus enjoys a special relationship with the Plague God that even Mortarian cannot challenge. Typhus's approach to warfare reflects Nurgle's philosophy of inexorable decay. Rather than swift strikes or complex strategies, he employs grinding attrition and biological warfare. His flagship, the Terminus Est, has become a legendary vessel of doom in Imperial naval records. When it appears in a system, planetary governors know that conventional defense is often futile, The ship brings not merely military threat, but supernatural plagues that can render a world uninhabitable before a single warrior makes planetfall. Unlike many Chaos champions who seek glorious single combat or dramatic conquests, Typhus measures success in planets corrupted and populations transformed into plague zombies. He views himself as a missionary spreading Nurgle's blessings rather than merely a destroyer. This perspective makes him particularly dangerous, as he approaches corruption with the patient certainty of a true believer rather than the fickle aggression typical of Chaos servants. Lucius the Eternal embodies perhaps the most disturbing form of corruption, the pursuit of perfection twisted into endless sadism. As a line officer in the Emperor's Children during the Great Crusade, Lucius distinguished himself through exceptional swordsmanship and a driving need to be recognized as the finest duelist in the Legion. This ambition, initially channeled into disciplined practice and legitimate achievement, contained the seeds of his eventual fall. The breaking point came during the Istvan III atrocity, where Lucius initially sided with the loyalist elements of the Emperor's Children against Horus's forces. After several successful engagements against his traitor brothers, Lucius found himself frustrated by the lack of worthy opponents. This dissatisfaction, combined with the realization that the loyalists were doomed, led him to betray his comrades. He contacted the traitor forces and arranged the massacre of his own men, earning reinstatement into the Legion's ranks through this act of calculated treachery. As the Emperor's Children fell further under Slaanesh's influence, Lucius embraced the pursuit of sensation with characteristic intensity. Where other Marines sought general stimulation, Lucius refined his focus to the perfect combination of martial prowess and inflicted suffering. He modified his armor with sensory amplifiers that allowed him to experience his opponent's pain as they died, creating a feedback loop of pleasure that became increasingly addictive. The defining moment in Lucius's transformation came after the heresy, during a duel with a fellow Emperor's Children champion named Lord Sirius. For the first time since his earliest training bouts, Lucius found himself outmatched. Sirius killed him with a precisely placed thrust through a gap in his armor, a clean, skillful kill that should have ended the swordsman's story. Instead, it began his eternal curse. In the days following the duel, Sirius began to change. His skin developed lesions that formed into familiar scars, the same self-inflicted markings that had covered Lucius's face. His body proportions shifted subtly, his combat reflexes altered, and his personality gradually transformed. Within weeks, Sirius was gone, and Lucius stood in his place, his consciousness having transferred to the body of the warrior who had taken satisfaction in killing him. This pattern has repeated countless times over the millennia. Lucius fights, occasionally meets a superior opponent, and dies, only to resurrect through his killer's body if they feel even the slightest pride or satisfaction in their victory. This curse, granted by Slaanesh, has made him effectively immortal. Only those who kill him with complete detachment, feeling nothing but grim necessity, seem immune to the transformation, a rare mindset in the heat of combat against such an infamous opponent. Lucius's armor has evolved to reflect his symbiotic relationship with Slaanesh. The armor of Shrieking Souls incorporates the faces of notable warriors who have slain him, their features frozen in expressions of agony as their souls remain trapped within the ceramite. These captured spirits experience every sensation Lucius feels, their eternal torment feeding directly to Slaanesh, while providing the swordsman with a constant audience for his martial performances. The most disturbing aspect of Lucius's condition is his awareness of its nature. Unlike many Chaos champions who delude themselves about their freedom, Lucius understands perfectly that he serves as Slaanesh's plaything. His pursuit of the perfect duel continues not because he believes he can achieve it, but because the journey itself, the endless cycle of combat, death, and rebirth, provides sensations that never grow stale. He has transcended mere addiction to become a pure embodiment of Slaanesh's principle that pursuit matters more than attainment. The formation of the Great Rift transformed the galaxy in ways that even the most prescient servants of Tzeentch could not have fully anticipated. As reality split along an astronomical wound, stretching from the Eye of Terror to the Eastern Fringe, the Chaos Space Marines found themselves presented with unprecedented opportunities. The Cicatrix Maledictum did not merely provide new avenues for invasion, it fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Long War, creating conditions that favored the servants of the Dark Gods as never before. For warbands operating from the Eye of Terror, the collapse of the Cadian Gate removed the most significant barrier to real space raids. Imperial defense networks that had stood for millennia were obliterated in the catastrophic warp storms that followed Cadia's destruction. Monitoring stations, patrol routes, and fortified systems that had contained Chaos forces were suddenly gone, allowing even minor warbands to penetrate deep into Imperial territory without encountering significant resistance. The Black Legion capitalized on this opportunity most effectively, with Abaddon deploying forces along strategic corridors through the Great Rift. These deployments followed patterns established during previous Black Crusades, focusing on systems that had been subtly corrupted by sleeper agents over centuries. As Imperial forces struggled to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe, Black Legion strike forces secured dozens of worlds that served as forward bases for further operations, creating a network of strongholds throughout what became known as the Imperium Nihilus. Perhaps more significant than these territorial gains was the psychological impact of the Great Rift. For citizens in the Imperium Nihilus, the Emperor's light, manifested through the Astronomicon, became inconsistent or vanished entirely. This tangible sign of abandonment created fertile ground for cults, rebellions, and mass conversions to Chaos worship. Black Legion agents exploited this despair ruthlessly, presenting themselves not as invaders, but as liberators offering alternative protection in a galaxy where the Emperor could no longer reach. The Death Guard found the post-Rift environment particularly advantageous for their style of warfare. Systems suffering from collapsed supply chains and failing infrastructure proved vulnerable to Nurgle's plagues in ways well-defended Imperial worlds had not been. Typhus led his plague fleet through the Rift's unstable passages, targeting agri-worlds and hive systems where overcrowding and deteriorating conditions had already created incubation grounds for disease. Where previous raids might have faced quarantine protocols and Imperial Navy interdiction, the isolated worlds of the Imperium Nihilus had no recourse when Death Guard vessels appeared in orbit. The Scourge Stars campaign exemplified this new approach to conquest. Rather than conducting hit-and-run raids, Mortarion committed nearly the full strength of the Death Guard to establishing a permanent foothold in real space. 7 systems fell in rapid succession, their populations transformed into plague zombies or converted into cultist armies. From this secure territory, Death Guard forces launched secondary campaigns against neighboring sectors, creating a spreading zone of corruption that Imperial forces could not contain without committing resources they no longer had available. For the Thousand Suns, the Great Rift offered more subtle but equally significant advantages. The thinning of the barrier between real space and the warp dramatically increased psychic potential among human populations across the galaxy. Latent psychers manifested abilities in unprecedented numbers, often without proper training or containment. Magnus directed his legion to locate and capture these emergent psychers, both as resources for rituals and as potential recruits to replace the legion's losses from the heresy. The planet of sorcerers itself, long trapped within the Eye of Terror, translated into real space near the devastated Fenris system, home of the Space Wolves and ancient enemies of the Thousand Suns. This was no coincidence, but the culmination of a ritual Magnus had prepared for millennia, timed to coincide with the reality-altering energies of the Great Rift's formation. With a stable base in real space, the Thousand Suns could project power more consistently than ever before, establishing cults on thousands of worlds and gathering psychic energy for Magnus's ultimate plans. For smaller warbands and renegade chapters, the post-Rift galaxy offered unprecedented freedom of movement. Imperial response times to raids increased from days to months or even years, allowing even modestly equipped forces to plunder worlds that would previously have been far beyond their reach. This operational latitude led to a surge in recruitment as opportunistic Chaos Lords expanded their warbands to exploit the new strategic reality. The Red Corsairs demonstrated particular skill in leveraging this changed environment. Huron Blackheart had spent centuries building a network of bases within the Maelstrom, developing expertise in operating through warp storms that suddenly became relevant across the galaxy. Red Corsair navigators, experienced in plotting courses through turbulent warp conditions, commanded premium prices from other chaos forces seeking to traverse the Great Rift. This positioning allowed Blackheart to expand his influence dramatically, with many smaller warbands swearing allegiance to the Tyrant of Badab in exchange for navigational assistance and access to his trade networks. The conquest of Vigilus represented perhaps the most strategically significant Chaos Space Marine operation in the immediate post-Rift period. This industrial world occupied a critical position, anchoring one of the few stable warp routes connecting the severed halves of the Imperium. Control of Vigilus would allow Imperial forces to maintain supply lines to the Imperium Nihilus while denying Chaos forces a convenient invasion corridor. Recognizing this value, Abaddon personally directed a complex campaign to seize the planet. Rather than launching a conventional assault, the despoiler employed a strategy of infiltration and subversion developed over millennia of warfare. Black Legion operatives had established cult networks on Vigilus years before the Great Rift formed, particularly in the Underhive regions where Imperial control was already tenuous. As these cults activated, they created multiple internal crises that forced planetary defenders to divide their attention, creating vulnerabilities for subsequent exploitation. The Black Legion's approach to urban warfare on Vigilus demonstrated their evolution from the tactics employed during the heresy. Rather than seeking decisive engagements, Chaos forces established zones of control within specific hab blocks and manufacturing districts, gradually expanding their territory while avoiding major confrontations with Space Marine defenders. Cultist forces absorbed Imperial counterattacks, their losses meaningless compared to the strategic value of drawing Loyalist units away from more significant targets. When Abaddon himself finally arrived on Vigilus, he did so not at the head of a massive invasion force, but with a relatively small retinue of elite troops. Using sorcerous methods to bypass Imperial defenses, the despoiler teleported directly into the planetary defense headquarters, decapitating the command structure before most defenders realized an attack was underway. This precision strike exemplified the Black Legion's increasingly sophisticated approach to warfare, combining traditional Astartes shock tactics with strategic patience developed over 10 millennia of conflict. Though Imperial reinforcements eventually prevented the complete conquest of Vigilus, the campaign demonstrated how effectively Chaos Space Marines had adapted to the post-Rift environment. Even partial control of the planet allowed Abaddon to disrupt Imperial supply lines and establish forward bases for further operations throughout the sector. More importantly, the resources devoted to defending Vigilus could not be deployed elsewhere, creating opportunities for other Chaos forces to expand their conquests in less heavily defended regions. The return of the Primaris Space Marines presented an unexpected challenge to Chaos forces accustomed to fighting the same opponents for millennia. These enhanced warriors, physically superior to traditional Astartes and equipped with newly developed weapons and armor, initially shifted the balance of power in localized conflicts throughout the Imperium. Chaos lords who had spent centuries studying the capabilities and limitations of Loyalist chapters suddenly faced opponents whose potential remained unknown. This advantage proved temporary. The Dark Mechanicum and Chaos sorcerers quickly obtained Primaris corpses for study, developing countermeasures to their enhanced physiology. More significantly, the Chaos gods recognized in these improved warriors a more valuable prize. Corrupting a Primaris Marine offered greater returns than turning their older counterparts. Targeted efforts to capture, rather than kill these warriors became common practice among warbands seeking to enhance their fighting strength. The first confirmed case of Primaris corruption occurred on Acheron's Reach, where Alpha Legion operatives introduced a modified strain of the Obliterator virus into the water supply of a Primaris garrison. The enhanced organs and reinforced physiology of the Primaris Marines intended to make them more resilient than their predecessors, paradoxically provided more substantial material for the virus to exploit. The resulting obliterators towered over even normal examples of these living weapon platforms, their enhanced musculature allowing them to manifest larger and more complex weapons directly from their flesh. The word-bearers developed more ritualistic approaches to Primaris corruption, focusing on the psychological vulnerabilities created by the unusual circumstances of their creation. Many Primaris Marines struggled with questions of identity and purpose, having been created from ancient gene seed and awakened into a galaxy 10 millennia removed from their genetic forebears. Dark Apostles crafted specific corrupting narratives targeting these uncertainties, presenting chaos worship as a path to self-determination for warriors who had been created as tools rather than individuals. The most efficient method of acquiring Primaris gene seed came not through battlefield capture, but through raids on vulnerable supply convoys. As the Imperium rushed to reinforce chapters throughout the galaxy, the logistical networks supporting this effort became prime targets for chaos attacks. A single successful raid could yield materials sufficient to create hundreds of enhanced Chaos Marines, making these operations high priorities for warbands seeking to maintain parity with their loyalist counterparts. Fabius Bile, the former chief apothecary of the Emperor's Children, took particular interest in Primaris physiology. Having spent millennia attempting to perfect the Astartes form through his own experiments, Bile recognized in Belisarius' calls work solutions to problems that had long frustrated his efforts. Bile's agents prioritized the capture of Primaris apothecaries and their equipment, seeking the technological and biological secrets behind these enhancements for incorporation into his own New Men project. The integration of corrupted Primaris Marines into existing Chaos warbands created internal tensions that manifested differently according to each group's culture. Within the Black Legion, where worth was measured primarily through battlefield performance, enhanced warriors quickly established positions of authority based on their superior capabilities. Among the Night Lords, whose hierarchy relied heavily on terror and intimidation, Primaris physiology provided advantages in the violent contests that determined leadership. The word-bearers, with their emphasis on ideological purity, required corrupted Primaris recruits to undergo extensive indoctrination before accepting them into the Legion's ritual structures. The return of the demon Primarchs to active participation in the Long War created another significant shift in Chaos Space Marine operations. Where Abaddon had served as the predominant Chaos commander for millennia, the reappearance of Mortarion and Magnus introduced competing power centers with their own strategic objectives and resources. This development created both opportunities and complications for Chaos forces throughout the galaxy. Mortarion's campaigns following his return demonstrated a methodical approach to conquest reflecting the Death Guard's character. Rather than seeking rapid territorial gains, the Demon Primarch focused on establishing permanent corruption in targeted systems. The Plague Wars in the Ultramar region exemplified this strategy, with Death Guard forces creating layered zones of contamination that remained virulent even when conventional forces were driven back. This approach transformed military defeats into strategic victories, as Imperial forces holding liberated territory continued to suffer from supernatural diseases that conventional medical technology could not address. Magnus pursued objectives aligned with his nature, as both a scholar and a being of immense psychic potential. The Crimson King directed his legion to secure artifacts, texts, and individuals with psychic significance, building toward rituals of unprecedented scale. Unlike Mortarion's territorial ambitions, Magnus focused on specific high-value targets, often withdrawing once these objectives were secured rather than holding ground against Imperial counterattacks. This selective approach allowed the Thousand Sons to maintain operational tempo despite their relatively small numbers compared to other traitor legions. The relationship between the Demon Primarchs and Abaddon remained complex and often adversarial. Neither Magnus nor Mortarion acknowledged the Despoiler's authority as War Master, viewing him as at best a capable commander of the Black Legion, rather than the true successor to Horus's mantle. This tension manifested in competing campaigns that sometimes worked at cross purposes, with resources that might have been combined for greater effect, instead divided among separate objectives. For rank and file Chaos Space Marines, the return of the Demon Primarchs created questions of loyalty and purpose that had not existed during the Primarchs' long absence. Warriors who had operated with relative autonomy for millennia suddenly faced demands for compliance from their gene fathers. This pressure proved particularly acute for those who had joined warbands outside their original legions, as Primarchs expected genetic lineage to trump all other allegiances. As the 42nd millennium progressed, the galaxy entered a period of unprecedented turmoil and opportunity for the servants of the Dark Gods. The Imperium, despite the return of Robute Guilliman and the deployment of Primaris reinforcements, found itself fighting a defensive war across thousands of fronts simultaneously. The Great Rift rendered traditional strategic doctrines obsolete, while the inconsistency of warp travel made coordinated responses to Chaos incursions nearly impossible in many regions. For the Chaos Space Marines, this new reality represented the culmination of the Long War, not a final victory, but the beginning of the Imperium's terminal decline. After 10,000 years of struggle, the balance had shifted decisively in their favor. Imperial worlds that had never known the touch of chaos found themselves defenseless against raids, corruption, and full-scale invasion. The psychological impact of visible chaos incursion into supposedly secure regions created cascading failures of morale and authority that no number of Primaris reinforcements could fully address. Yet even in this moment of ascendancy, the fundamental contradictions within chaos remained. The same forces that made the traitor Astartes such potent weapons against the Imperium, ambition, individualism, and devotion to entities that embodied cosmic discord, prevented them from fully capitalizing on their advantages. Where loyalist forces fought with diminished resources but unified purpose, Chaos warbands continued to compete as much as cooperate, each pursuing objectives aligned with their patron gods or personal ambitions rather than a coherent strategic vision. This eternal contradiction defines the Chaos Space Marines in the 42nd millennium. They stand at the threshold of potential victory, with the Imperium fragmented and vulnerable as never before. Yet the very nature of chaos ensures that this advantage may never translate into final triumph. The Long War continues not because ultimate victory remains elusive, but because for the servants of the Dark Gods, the conflict itself has become purpose rather than means, an eternal struggle that gives meaning to existences stretched across millennia of hatred, ambition, and the corrupting touch of the warp.